My son called me on a Tuesday morning to casually mention he had drained my entire life savings of $150,000 to pay for his luxury wedding. He told me he assumed I would not mind. What he did not realize was that I knew everything and his betrayal was far worse than I could have imagined. Before I tell you how I tore his perfect life apart, hit like and subscribe and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Have you ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth? My name is Nelson Wright. I am 69 years old. For most of my life, I believed that if you worked hard, loved your family, and provided for your children, you would earn a peaceful retirement. I was wrong. It was a quiet morning in Atlanta. The Georgia sun was just starting to warm the front porch of the legacy home I had owned for 40 years. I was sitting in my favorite rocking chair, sipping my black coffee and listening to the neighborhood wake up. Then my phone rang. It was my son Kendrick. He is 32 years old, a regional sales manager who constantly tries to erase his working-class roots to fit in with his wealthy white future-in-laws. I answered the phone with a smile. "Good morning, son," I said. There was no greeting in return. His voice was flat, rushed, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Dad, I am just calling to let you know I transferred the $150,000 from the joint family retirement account to pay for the wedding vendors. Megan and her family expect a certain standard, and we were falling short. I figured since you are just sitting around the house these days, you would not need it anytime soon. You understand, right?" Before I could even process the words, before my brain could register the absolute absurdity of what he had just confessed, the line went dead. He hung up. Just like that. I sat frozen in my rocking chair. The phone felt like a block of lead in my hand. The silence that followed his abrupt hang-up was deafening. My coffee suddenly tasted like bitter ash. $150,000. To Kendrick, it was just a number on a screen, a quick fix to impress his snobby fiancée Megan Kensington and her supposedly wealthy father. But to me, that money was the story of my life. I looked down at my hands. They were heavily calloused, scarred from decades of gripping steel and concrete. I had spent 40 years working as a structural engineer. I was out in the blistering southern heat wearing a hard hat and steel-toed boots, building bridges and office buildings so my son would never have to struggle. I remembered my late wife Diane, God rest her soul. Diane used to wake up at 4 in the morning to pack my lunches. We skipped summer vacations, drove old cars until the engines gave out, and clipped grocery coupons for years. We built that safety net dollar by agonizing dollar. It was meant to cover my heart medication, my property taxes, and my eventual end-of-life care. Diane passed away 10 years ago, holding my hand and making me promise I would take care of myself. And now the boy we raised, the boy we sacrificed everything for, had wiped out 40 years of our blood and sweat in a matter of seconds. He did not ask. He did not borrow. He stole. And he justified it because I was just sitting around. I did not scream. I did not throw my coffee mug against the wall. A cold, heavy calm washed over me. When you survive what I have survived in this life, you do not panic. You investigate. I walked back inside, put on my best press suit, and grabbed my car keys. The drive to my bank in downtown Atlanta was a blur of traffic and swirling thoughts. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the branch I had used for over 3 decades. The tellers knew me by name. I went straight to the desk of the branch manager, Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis smiled warmly when he saw me, but his smile faltered the moment he read the expression on my face. "Nelson, it is good to see you. How can I help you today?" I sat down slowly, keeping my posture rigid and my voice dangerously low. "I need to see the transaction history for my primary retirement account. Right now." Mr. Davis quickly typed on his keyboard. As his eyes scanned the monitor, the color drained from his face. He adjusted his glasses, looking incredibly uncomfortable. "Nelson, I see a full wire transfer was initiated late yesterday afternoon for the entire balance of $150,000. The funds were routed to a private event management company." My chest tightened. "Who authorized it?" I asked, my voice remaining completely steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Well, your son Kendrick authorized it," Mr. Davis replied nervously. "As a joint account holder, he has the clearance to initiate transfers. But that is not all, Nelson. The beneficiary information on the account was also completely altered yesterday morning." I leaned forward. "Altered to whom?" Mr. Davis swallowed hard. "The sole beneficiary of this account and the authorized secondary access party was changed from Kendrick Wright to Megan Kensington, your soon-to-be daughter-in-law." My vision blurred for a fraction of a second. Megan Kensington. A 28-year-old woman who had never worked a hard day in her life. A woman who looked at me with thinly veiled disgust every time she stepped foot in my house. My son had not only stolen my life savings, but he had handed the keys to my financial legacy directly to a spoiled, entitled outsider. He had effectively erased my existence and handed my life over to her. How could he do that? I demanded, tapping my finger on the heavy wooden desk. How could my son remove my name as the primary controller and hand it over to a woman I barely know? Megan Kensington has absolutely no legal right to my retirement fund. I have never signed any document allowing an outsider to take control of my accounts. You and I have done business for 30 years, Mr. Davis. You know I would never authorize such a reckless change. Mr. Davis looked at me with deep sympathy, but his hands were tied by the cold, hard rules of the banking system. He turned his computer monitor so I could see the screen. Nelson, I understand your frustration, he said softly. But from a legal standpoint, our hands are tied. The change of beneficiary and the massive withdrawal were processed because we received formal notarized documentation approving the alterations. I stared at him in disbelief. What documentation? I have not signed a single piece of paper from this bank in over 2 years. Mr. Davis opened a file drawer and pulled out a manila envelope. He slid a crisp, freshly printed document across the desk toward me. It was a comprehensive legal directive. This was filed yesterday morning, Mr. Davis explained, pointing to the bottom of the page. It grants Kendrick full unilateral control over your financial assets, including the ability to add external parties like Megan Kensington. I picked up the heavy sheet of paper. My eyes scanned the bold legal jargon at the top. It was a durable power of attorney. It effectively declared that I was granting my son total dominion over my life, my money, and my property. Then I looked at the bottom right corner. There in black ink was my signature, Nelson Wright. It looked perfectly identical to the way I had signed my name for the last 40 years. Every curve, every loop, every slanted letter was a flawless match. But there was one massive, undeniable problem. I had never seen this document before in my life. I had never sat in front of a notary. I had never agreed to hand over my freedom. Someone had meticulously and flawlessly forged my signature on a legal document to strip me of my wealth. And I knew exactly who had the motive, the arrogance, and the opportunity to do it. I did not confront Kendrick that day. Confrontation requires strategy, and I was still gathering my ammunition. 3 days later, I drove to the extravagant country club where the wedding reception was being held. I wore the same charcoal suit I had worn to Diane's funeral. It was clean-pressed and respectable, but it clearly lacked the designer labels flaunted by the other guests. Walking into that grand ballroom felt like stepping into an alternate reality. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over towering floral centerpieces that cost more than a reliable used car. A string quartet played softly in the background. My life savings had bought this spectacle, yet I was treated like an unwelcome trespasser. A hostess with a clipboard looked me up and down, her smile tight and insincere, before escorting me to my seat. She did not lead me to the front row where the groom's father belonged. Instead, she guided me to the very back of the room behind a massive decorative pillar. My table was squeezed next to the swinging kitchen doors. I was not seated with family. I was seated with the off-duty catering staff and a couple of distant, bewildered acquaintances of the bride, who clearly did not make the top-tier guest list. Waiters rushed past me carrying trays of expensive champagne, bumping the back of my chair. I sat there in silence, smoothing the lapels of my old suit, watching the elite crowd mingle. I was the father of the groom, the man who had unknowingly bankrolled this entire lavish affair, and I had been shoved into a dark corner like a dirty secret they needed to hide. From my secluded vantage point, I watched the Kensington family hold court. Richard Kensington. Megan's father moved through the room like a king surveying his conquered lands. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo and carried a crystal glass of bourbon. To the outside world, Richard projected the image of a highly successful real estate developer. But the way he looked at me during the brief moments our eyes accidentally met from across the vast room told a different story. His gaze was heavy with undisguised contempt. He looked at me not as a fellow patriarch, but as an uncomfortable blemish on his perfect aesthetic. I was an older, working-class black man who did not fit into his country club narrative. Kendrick, my own flesh and blood, had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to mold himself into Richard's ideal son. Kendrick mirrored Richard's posture, laughed too loudly at his jokes, and actively avoided looking in my direction. I realized then that my exclusion was not an oversight, it was a calculated decision. Megan and Richard wanted the prestige of a grand wedding without the embarrassment of acknowledging where the money actually came from. They viewed my blackness and my calloused hands as liabilities. They happily drained my bank account, but refused to let me exist in their pristine world. I watched Megan float around the dance floor in a custom silk gown that my sweat and tears had purchased. She smiled sweetly for the cameras, a picture of affluent innocence. The sheer audacity of their hypocrisy burned in my chest, but I maintained a stoic expression. I sipped my water and waited, knowing the true depth of their arrogance would reveal itself soon enough. The string quartet stopped playing, replaced by the sharp clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute. The room fell silent as Richard Kensington stepped up to the grand podium at the front of the ballroom. The spotlight hit him, making his silver hair shine. Kendrick and Megan stood proudly beside him, beaming at the crowd. Richard adjusted the microphone, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. Family, friends, esteemed colleagues, Richard began, his voice echoing through the expensive sound system. We are gathered here today to celebrate the union of my beautiful daughter Megan and her new husband Kendrick. When Megan came to me and told me about her dream wedding, I knew I had to make it a reality. As a father, there is nothing I would not do to give my little girl the world. He paused, letting the crowd murmur their approval. Let us be honest, Richard continued with a hearty chuckle. A spectacular event like this does not come cheap. But when I looked at the venue, the imported flowers, the gourmet menu, and the six-piece band, I did not hesitate to write that $150,000 check. I gladly funded every single detail you see here tonight because my daughter deserves nothing but the absolute best. The room erupted into thunderous applause. Guests raised their glasses, toasting Richard's immense generosity and incredible wealth. I sat frozen behind the pillar, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. He was lying through his teeth. Richard Kensington had not spent a single dime on this wedding. Every flower, every glass of champagne, every stitch of silk on Megan's dress was paid for by the retirement fund I had built over 40 agonizing years. But the worst part was not Richard's lie. The worst part was Kendrick. My son stood right next to that podium looking out at the crowd of wealthy strangers. He smiled, raised his own glass, and nodded enthusiastically in agreement with Richard's speech. Kendrick was actively participating in the erasure of my sacrifice. He allowed another man to take the credit for the life savings he had stolen from his own father. He looked at Richard with pure admiration, completely discarding the man who had raised him, fed him, and paid for his college education. At that moment, the boy I had raised ceased to exist. He was gone, replaced by a greedy, spineless puppet, desperate for the validation of a racist, arrogant fraud. The applause eventually died down, and the band started playing a lively jazz tune. I had seen and heard enough. I stood up from my hidden table, pushing past the kitchen doors, intending to find Kendrick in private. I needed to look him in the eye and see if he had any shred of conscience left. I navigated the maze of opulent hallways, avoiding the main crowd, and turned toward the private dressing suites near the back of the venue. As I approached the bridal suite, I heard hushed, frantic voices echoing around the corner. I stopped dead in my tracks, pressing my back against the ornate wallpaper. It was Megan and Kendrick. "You need to stop acting so nervous out there," Megan hissed, her sweet bridal facade completely gone. Her voice was sharp and demanding. "Richard just gave you the perfect cover. Nobody suspects a thing." I know," Kendrick stammered, sounding breathless. "But my dad was sitting right there. What if he checks his bank statements this week? What if he realizes the money is gone? Who cares if the old man finds out?" Megan snapped coldly. "By the time he figures it out, we will be completely insulated. But you have to move on to the next phase immediately. My father is running out of time. You need to finalize the mortgage on your dad's house by Monday. We need that property equity cleared and transferred, or this entire marriage was for nothing." I stopped breathing. The air in the hallway turned to ice. The stolen $150,000 was not the end of their scheme. It was just the appetizer. They were coming for my house. I did not confront them in that hallway. If I burst into the bridal suite demanding answers, they would lie, deflect, or worse, speed up whatever malicious timeline they were working on. Instead, I turned on my heel and walked out of that opulent country club without looking back. The valet brought my old sedan, and I tipped him with a steady hand, but inside my chest felt like it was violently caving in. The drive through the dark Atlanta streets was a complete blur of neon lights and racing thoughts. My own son was actively plotting to steal my home. The loss of the $150,000 was devastating, but the house was my sanctuary. It was the only tangible thing Diane and I had left to show for a lifetime of backbreaking labor. I could not afford to wait until Monday morning to find out what was happening. I grabbed my phone from the passenger seat and dialed the only man I could implicitly trust in a crisis like this. Robert Pierce was not just a brilliant, aggressive attorney. He was an old friend who deeply understood the stakes of what I was facing. He had helped Diane and me draft our original wills years ago. I knew he was likely asleep, but I did not care. When he picked up, his voice was thick with sleep, but he quickly sharpened when he heard the absolute desperation in my tone. "Robert, I need your help right now," I said, my voice tight and strained. "Kendrick has forged a power of attorney. He already drained my entire retirement account, and now he is coming for my house. I need to know exactly what he has done, and I need to know tonight." Robert did not hesitate for a single second. "Meet me at my downtown office in 20 minutes, he replied. I pressed the gas pedal down, my knuckles turning white against the steering wheel. I was not going to lose everything I built to a spoiled child and his greedy in-laws. To understand why Megan and her arrogant father were suddenly so deeply interested in my property, you have to understand what my house actually represents. Diane and I bought that property over 40 years ago. Back then, it was just a modest 2-story Craftsman in a historically black working-class neighborhood on the east side of Atlanta. We paid barely $40,000 for it, scraping together every dime we had for the down payment. Over the decades, I used my engineering background to reinforce the foundation, expand the rooms, and meticulously restore the original woodwork. It was our masterpiece. But in recent years, the city began to change rapidly. Developers swept into our side of town, bulldozing the old legacy homes and replacing them with towering luxury condos and trendy commercial spaces. Gentrification hit our neighborhood like a tidal wave. Property taxes skyrocketed, and almost all of my old neighbors were systematically priced out or bought out by aggressive corporate developers. But I stubbornly refused to sell. I held my ground. Because of the massive redevelopment surrounding it, my once modest family home was now sitting on a prime piece of real estate. Last year, the city assessed the property value at a staggering $1.2 million. It was a literal gold mine sitting right in the middle of a developer's playground. Richard Kensington was exactly that kind of predatory developer. He built his phony empire by snapping up undervalued properties and flipping them for massive profits. I suddenly realized that to Richard, my son was not a welcome addition to his wealthy family. Kendrick was merely a convenient, gullible Trojan horse. They had manipulated my boy into handing over the keys to $1 million asset that they could never have acquired legally. I arrived at Robert's downtown office just as he was unlocking the heavy glass doors. He wore a rumpled sweater over his pajamas, holding a thermos of black coffee, but his eyes were razor-sharp and alert. We hurried into his suite, and he immediately fired up his computer. "Hand me that fake power of attorney you got from the bank," Robert commanded, holding out his hand. I slid the copied document across his mahogany desk. He scanned the legal jargon, his jaw clenching tighter with every line he read. "Nelson, this document is horrifyingly comprehensive," Robert muttered, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he logged into the county and state financial databases. Whoever drafted this knew exactly what they were doing. It gives Kendrick absolute authority to borrow against your assets, sell your properties, and liquidate your accounts without your physical presence or verbal consent. I paced the length of the office, the carpet muffling my anxious footsteps. "Can you see if he has touched the house yet?" I asked, dreading the answer. Robert stared at his monitor, his face illuminated by the harsh blue glow of the screen. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Then he stopped typing. He let out a slow, heavy sigh and took off his reading glasses. "Nelson, you need to sit down." I stopped pacing but refused to take a seat. "Just tell me, Robert. Give it to me straight." Robert turned the monitor toward me. "Kendrick did not just drain your bank account, Nelson. Using this forged power of attorney, he took out a massive home equity line of credit against your property. The paperwork was expedited and finalized late Friday afternoon. He borrowed $400,000 against your house." The number hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer. $400,000. My home, fully paid off for over a decade, was now buried under a mountain of debt. Where did the money go? I demanded, leaning over the desk to look at the digitized financial routing numbers. Robert highlighted a specific line on the screen. The funds were not deposited into your account or even into Kendrick's personal account. The entire $400,000 was wired immediately to a corporate holding account. The registered owner of that holding company is Kensington Prime Real Estate, Richard Kensington's firm. It was a perfectly executed heist. Megan and her father had used my son to legally rob me blind. They were using my own house as a personal piggy bank to fund Richard's business. If that mortgage was not paid, the bank would foreclose on my home and I would be thrown out onto the street. The sheer magnitude of their deception left me completely breathless. I was standing in a quiet law office in the middle of the night, realizing that the family I was supposed to be celebrating had secretly engineered my absolute financial ruin. Robert began pulling out blank legal pads and clicking his pen. "We need to file an emergency injunction tomorrow morning," he said urgently. "We have to contest the validity of this power of attorney and freeze the asset transfers before Richard can move that money offshore or hide it in shell companies." Before I could even formulate a response, a harsh blaring alarm erupted from my jacket pocket. I flinched, yanking my phone out. It was a high-priority push notification from the smart security system I had installed around my property a few months ago. The screen flashed bright red, motion detected at front porch and side alley. I unlocked the phone and quickly opened the live camera feed. The video loaded, showing the crisp black and white night vision of my front yard. My heart lodged firmly in my throat. Kendrick was standing on my porch. He was still wearing his tailored wedding tuxedo, the bow tie undone and hanging loosely around his neck. But he was not alone. Standing next to my son was a tall, unfamiliar white man holding a heavy-duty laser measuring device and a thick clipboard. The stranger was shining a flashlight along the load-bearing walls of my house, scribbling rapid notes while Kendrick pointed toward the foundation. I watched in absolute horror as the stranger handed Kendrick a large, rolled-up document. He unrolled it under the porch light. It was an architectural demolition plan. They were not just stealing my home's equity. They were already plotting to tear my legacy to the ground. I watched the screen of my phone as Kendrick and the unfamiliar man rolled up the architectural demolition blueprints and walked away from my property into the dark night. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to throw open the front door, charge out onto the lawn, and confront my son. I wanted to grab him by his tailored collar and demand to know how he could sell out his own father to a predator like Richard Kensington. But anger makes you reckless, and recklessness makes you vulnerable. I had spent my entire career building bridges that withstood Category 5 hurricanes and commercial high-rises designed to endure massive earthquakes. You do not survive that kind of intense pressure by acting impulsively. You survive by understanding the structural weaknesses of your enemy and quietly reinforcing your own position. I told Robert to hold off on filing the emergency legal injunction. Dropping a lawsuit on them now would only tip them off and give Richard time to hide the stolen $400,000 in offshore shell companies. I needed to know exactly how deep this rot went. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, I made a phone call to a former engineering colleague who now ran a private high-end commercial security firm. Within 2 hours, a discreet, unmarked van pulled into my driveway. I did not want obvious security cameras mounted on the walls where Kendrick could spot them. I needed invisible, indisputable proof of their conspiracy. The technician worked quickly and silently. He installed high-definition microcameras disguised as standard electrical outlets and smoke detectors. He placed military-grade motion-activated audio recorders directly under the heavy oak dining table in the living room and beneath the marble island in the kitchen. They were wired to a secure encrypted cloud server that routed straight to a hidden application on my phone. By noon, my beloved family home had been transformed into a sophisticated surveillance trap. I could hear a pin drop in the kitchen from my living room chair. I sat on my sofa testing the audio feeds through a tiny wireless earpiece, waiting for the rats to take the bait. I did not have to wait long. Later that weekend, the front doorbell chimed. I checked the live camera feed on my phone. It was Kendrick and Megan standing on my porch looking like the picture-perfect, deeply concerned newlyweds. I took a slow, steadying breath, burying the boiling rage deep down in my chest, and opened the door with a practiced, gentle smile. Kendrick stepped inside, first clapping me on the shoulder with a hollow, forced enthusiasm that made my skin crawl. Megan trailed behind him, her designer heels clicking sharply against my hardwood floors. She wrinkled her nose slightly, scanning my living room as if the very air in my house offended her delicate upper-class sensibilities. She thrust a cheap plastic grocery bag toward me. It contained a few bruised apples and a bunch of overripe bananas with brown spots. We were just in the neighborhood, and wanted to bring you some fresh fruit." Megan said, her voice dripping with that sickeningly sweet fake charm she used whenever she wanted to sound polite. I took the plastic bag, feeling the immense weight of the insult. This woman was currently living off $400,000 stolen from my home equity, and she had the audacity to bring me discount rotting fruit as a peace offering. "Thank you," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even and pleasant. "That is very thoughtful of you both. Please come sit down in the living room. Let me get you some ice water." I turned my back to them and walked into the kitchen. The sheer physical effort it took not to turn around and throw the bag of garbage fruit at my son was staggering. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter until my knuckles turned white, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I reached into my pocket and slipped the small wireless earpiece into my right ear, making sure it was completely hidden from view. I carried a tray of water glasses back into the living room and set it down on the coffee table, placing it directly above one of the hidden microphones. Kendrick and Megan were sitting uncomfortably close together on my sofa, exchanging nervous, calculated glances. I sat down across from them, folding my hands patiently in my lap, and waited for their performance to begin. Kendrick leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, projecting an Oscar-worthy image of deep filial concern. "Dad, we really wanted to check on you." He started, his brow furrowed in mock worry. "You left the wedding reception so early the other night. You did not even come find us to say goodbye. We were worried sick about you driving home alone." I looked him right in the eyes, refusing to blink. "I was tired, Kendrick. It was a long day." Megan chimed in immediately, placing a perfectly manicured hand on Kendrick's knee. "Well, that is exactly why we are here today, Nelson. You have just seemed so exhausted lately, and honestly a little confused." I raised a skeptical eyebrow, leaning back in my chair. "Confused? What makes you say that, Megan?" Kendrick sighed heavily, acting like a loyal son burdened by his father's sudden tragic decline. "Dad, you have been forgetting things all month. You missed the rehearsal dinner entirely. You keep misplacing your house keys. And yesterday when I called you, you thought it was Thursday instead of Saturday. It is just not like you. You used to be so sharp, but lately your mind seems to be slipping." It was a masterful, highly coordinated gaslighting routine. I had not missed the rehearsal dinner. I was explicitly told by Megan that it was a private event for the bridal party only. I had never misplaced my keys, and I certainly knew what day of the week it was. They were systematically laying the psychological groundwork to paint me as a senile, incompetent old man. They were building a false medical narrative right to my face. "You know, Nelson," Megan said softly, leaning closer with fake sympathy, "living in this big old house all by yourself is a lot of responsibility. The constant upkeep, the steep stairs, the complicated bills. It is too much for someone your age to handle, especially when your memory is starting to fail. You need proper rest. You need round-the-clock care." I kept my face entirely blank, masking the absolute disgust churning violently in my gut. "I see. And what exactly do you two suggest I do?" "We just want you to be safe, Dad," Kendrick said, avoiding my direct gaze and staring at the floor. "We are looking into some upscale assisted living communities, places where you will not have to worry about a single thing. We can handle the house and your finances. You just need to focus on resting." I rubbed my temples slowly, giving them the exact performance they desperately wanted to see. I let my shoulders slump, making myself look physically smaller, older, and completely defeated. "You know what?" I murmured, letting my voice tremble just enough to be convincing. "Maybe you two are right. My head has been pounding all morning and I feel incredibly weak. I think I just need to go to my bedroom, lie down, and take a long nap. You two make yourselves at home." I slowly stood up, deliberately shuffling my feet slightly against the floorboards as I walked down the hall toward my master bedroom. I closed the heavy wooden door behind me, but I did not go anywhere near the bed. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, tapped my hidden earpiece, and cranked the volume up to the maximum level. Through the crisp, high-definition audio feed, I heard the rustle of clothing as Kendrick and Megan immediately stood up from the sofa. I heard their footsteps moving quickly away from the living room and straight into my kitchen. "Did you see him?" Megan whispered sharply, her sweet, caring tone vanishing instantly into thin air. "He practically admitted he is losing his mind. The judge is going to buy this incompetent act in a heartbeat." "I know," Kendrick replied, his voice hushed and incredibly anxious. "But we still need documented medical proof. My father-in-law's lawyer said behavioral anecdotes are not enough to force a guardianship. We need a real recorded medical incident on paper before the end of the month. I heard the sound of my kitchen cabinets opening and closing, followed by the clinking of glassware. Then Megan's voice cut through the earpiece, cold, calculating, and terrifyingly methodical. "That is exactly why I brought these from Richard's private doctor," she said. "Start mixing the heavy liquid sedatives into his daily meals. We will crush the sleeping pills into his soup and dissolve them in his coffee. When he wanders outside completely disoriented or collapses in the front yard from the dosage, we will call the paramedics. We will have the hospital records proving his severe dementia before next Friday." I waited in the cold silence of my bedroom until I heard the heavy thud of the front door closing. I immediately checked the exterior security cameras on my phone to confirm Kendrick and Megan were walking back to their car. Once they pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street, I stepped out of my room and walked straight into the kitchen. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs, but my hands were entirely steady. I went directly to the wooden cabinet where I kept my morning supplements and pulled down the large amber plastic bottle of daily vitamins. I unscrewed the cap and poured the contents onto the pristine marble countertop. Amidst the familiar powdery yellow capsules, several small pale blue pills were completely out of place. They were tiny, unmarked, and strategically mixed in so an inattentive old man would swallow them without a second thought. I picked one up, examining it closely under the harsh kitchen lights. I knew exactly what this was. I had worked on enough high-stress construction sites to recognize industrial-strength chemical sedatives when I saw them. These were not over-the-counter sleeping aids. These were heavy prescription-grade tranquilizers known to induce severe disorientation, slurred speech, and terrifying hallucinations in elderly patients. If I had blindly swallowed my morning handful of vitamins, I would have been wandering the streets of Atlanta in a chemically induced stupor within an hour. I would have been entirely helpless, perfectly playing the role of the tragic dementia-ridden father they needed for their legal narrative. I did not throw the blue pills away. I carefully separated every single one of them, slipped them into a small plastic Ziploc bag, and tucked them safely into my jacket pocket. They were no longer a deadly threat. They were undeniable physical evidence of attempted poisoning. I grabbed a damp cloth to wipe down the counter, ensuring no trace of my search was left behind for them to find later. As I tossed the paper towel into the kitchen trash can, something bright and glossy caught my eye near the bottom of the bin. It was a crumpled pamphlet hastily discarded among the coffee grounds. I reached in and pulled it out, smoothing the heavy cardstock flat against the counter. The glossy cover displayed a faded, highly edited photograph of an institutional brick building surrounded by a barren, dying lawn. The bold letters across the top read, "Shady Pines State Care Facility." It was a brochure for a heavily underfunded state-run nursing home located on the absolute desolate outskirts of the county. I knew of this place. Every working-class family in Atlanta knew of this place. It was notorious for severe understaffing, rampant health code violations, and horrific living conditions. It was the kind of facility where wards of the state were sent to be entirely forgotten. Kendrick and Megan had just sat in my living room looking me dead in the eye and promised they were researching upscale assisted living communities with round-the-clock luxury care. That was another brilliant, sickening lie. They had absolutely no intention of paying for a comfortable medical facility using the $400,000 they stole from my home equity. They intended to dump me in a decaying government-subsidized warehouse for the forgotten. They wanted to lock me away in a sterile room where no one would ask questions while they lived like royalty on the fortune I had spent my entire life building. I folded the brochure and placed it right next to the bag of sedatives in my pocket. The following Tuesday, Kendrick stopped by the house unannounced, ostensibly to check on my health. I knew he was really there to monitor the effects of the tranquilizers he thought I had been blindly swallowing all week. I decided it was time to give my son exactly the performance he was so desperately waiting to see. When he walked through the front door, I was standing in the living room wearing a mismatched sweater over my pajama pants. I had intentionally skipped shaving for 3 days, giving my face a hollow, unkempt appearance. I stared blankly at the wall, pretending not to notice him entering the room. Dad Kendrick called out, his voice laced with a predatory eagerness. "Are you feeling all right? You look terrible." I turned to face him, widening my eyes in feigned confusion. I let my jaw go slightly slack and forced my hands to develop a noticeable rhythmic tremor. "Who is that?" I mumbled, slurring my words heavily. "Is that you, Marcus?" I purposely used the name of my late brother. Kendrick's eyes lit up with malicious triumph. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his smartphone. "No, Dad, it is Kendrick," he said, stepping closer, holding the phone at chest level. The small red recording light on his screen was glaringly obvious. I stumbled backward, pretending to lose my balance. I reached out to grab a decorative ceramic vase off the hallway table to steady myself. Instead of gripping it, I intentionally swatted the vase onto the hardwood floor. It shattered into dozens of sharp pieces with a loud, violent crash. I slumped down against the wall, burying my face in my trembling hands, acting entirely overwhelmed and terrified by the noise. "I am so sorry," I whimpered, rocking back and forth. "I do not know where I am. I cannot remember how to get to the kitchen." Through the gaps in my fingers, I watched my son. Kendrick did not drop to his knees to comfort his supposedly terrified father. He did not ask if I was cut by the broken ceramic. He simply stood over me, adjusting the angle of his phone camera to ensure he captured every pathetic detail of my manufactured breakdown. A cruel, satisfied smile spread across his face. He was documenting my artificial decline, gathering the digital ammunition he needed for his upcoming court petition. He was practically salivating at the thought of stealing my freedom. After recording a full minute of my performance, he simply stepped over the broken glass and walked out the front door without saying another word. The second I heard Kendrick's car engine fade down the street, my trembling completely stopped. I stood up from the floor, my posture instantly straightening, and calmly swept the broken ceramic shards into a dustpan. The act was over. I had given him his false evidence, which would only make the impending trap that much more devastating. Just as I threw the glass into the trash, my cell phone vibrated sharply in my pocket. It was a secure call from my attorney, Robert Pierce. I answered immediately. Nelson Robert said, his voice unusually fast and incredibly tense. "I have had my forensic accountants digging into Richard Kensington's corporate holdings all week. We just cracked the encrypted financial ledgers from his primary real estate firm. What you are about to hear changes the entire landscape of this situation." I leaned against the kitchen counter, my full attention instantly captured. "Tell me, Robert, what did you find?" "The Kensington family is completely broke," Nelson Robert declared. "Richard has been projecting the image of a billionaire developer, but his entire empire is a massive, crumbling house of cards. He is currently facing over $5 million in toxic defaulting debts. He owes millions to aggressive private lenders and commercial banks. They are mere days away from total catastrophic bankruptcy." I absorbed the information, the final pieces of the puzzle snapping into perfect, horrifying alignment. Richard was not a wealthy benefactor. He was a desperate, drowning man. And Megan was not marrying my son out of love or even social status. She was deployed as a financial parasite. The entire marriage, the extravagant wedding, the forged power of attorney, it was all a meticulously calculated rescue mission. They were using my son to hijack the $1.2 million equity in my property to save the Kensington family from complete financial annihilation. I ended the call with Robert and placed the phone on the kitchen counter. The revelation about Richard Kensington and his impending bankruptcy clarified every single agonizing detail of their plot. They thought I was a helpless, aging target. They thought my entire financial existence was limited to that joint retirement account and the equity sitting in the walls of this house. They were severely mistaken. I walked out of the kitchen and headed straight into my private study at the back of the house. I locked the heavy oak door behind me, ensuring no one could simply walk in, and pulled back the large Persian rug covering the center of the room. Beneath the woven fabric was a solid steel floor safe, set flush into the concrete foundation. I knelt down on the hardwood floor and spun the combination dial with practiced precision. My late wife Diane had always been the true financial visionary of our household. While I was out building physical skyscrapers and mixing concrete, she was quietly building an impenetrable financial fortress for our family. She understood the harsh economic realities of the world and knew we needed a hidden reserve that no one could ever touch. Before she passed away, Diane established an irrevocable private trust fueled by a massive high-yield life insurance policy she had paid into for decades. Kendrick knew absolutely nothing about this money. We purposefully kept it a strict secret from him because Diane had always worried about his reckless spending habits and his desperate need to impress the wrong kind of wealthy people. She was incredibly right to be cautious. I reached into the dark cavity of the floor safe and pulled out a thick leather-bound folio. Inside were the verified bank certificates and legal routing documents for the trust. The account held exactly $2 million in completely liquid, untraceable capital. The realization that my wife had essentially saved my life from beyond the grave gave me a profound sense of peace amidst the chaos. Kendrick thought he had crippled me by stealing $150,000 from my checking account. He had no idea he had just brought a tiny pocket knife to a massive nuclear fight. I placed the leather folio on my passenger seat and drove straight back to Robert's downtown law office. I walked past his stunned receptionist and dropped the heavy stack of verified financial certificates directly onto his mahogany desk. Robert stared at the documents, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he read the 7-figure balance printed on the bank letterhead. "Nelson," he breathed out, adjusting his glasses and looking at me as if I were a ghost. "I had no idea you possessed this kind of liquid capital. Why did you not mention this earlier when we were reviewing the stolen funds?" I pulled up a chair, sat down heavily, and looked my trusted lawyer dead in the eye. "Because up until this morning I was only planning to defend my property and get my original savings back," I told him flatly. "But now that I know Richard Kensington is a drowning man trying to use my son as a financial life raft, mere defense is no longer a viable option. I want to buy my enemies. I need you to create a completely anonymous corporate shell company right now." Robert did not hesitate for a single second. He immediately understood the assignment. Within the hour, he had filed the expedited paperwork with the state to establish a blind limited liability company. We named it Phoenix Holdings. It was a fitting title for what was about to happen. My legacy was going to rise from the ashes of their deceit, and it was going to burn their entire fake empire to the ground. Phoenix Holdings was officially registered in Delaware, a move that effectively shielded my personal identity from any public records or corporate registry searches. As far as the financial sector was concerned, Phoenix Holdings was just a massive, faceless investment firm backed by deep institutional pockets. Robert linked the new corporate entity directly to Diane's secret trust, giving us immediate unfettered access to the $2 million. We now had the perfect invisible weapon to dismantle Richard Kensington. The strategy was brutal, but incredibly simple. Richard owed over $5 million to various commercial banks and private lenders, but because his real estate firm was defaulting on every single payment, that debt was considered highly toxic. Banks absolutely despise carrying toxic, non-performing debt on their official ledgers. It damages their credit ratings and frightens their shareholders. They are almost always willing to sell off those bad loans to third-party collection agencies or private equity firms for a fraction of the original cost, just to rapidly clear their accounting books. I instructed Robert to immediately contact every single one of Richard's major creditors on behalf of Phoenix Holdings. We moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. Robert aggressively negotiated with the banking executives, offering them instant guaranteed cash in exchange for the legal transfer of Richard's outstanding loans. The bankers were thrilled to offload the massive financial liability. They eagerly signed over the promissory notes without asking a single question about who was actually funding the purchase behind the corporate veil. By the end of the business day, I had authorized a series of massive wire transfers from the hidden trust account. We spent exactly $1.8 million to quietly absorb the entirety of Richard Kensington's crushing $5 million debt portfolio. The paperwork was finalized and legally recorded before the banks even closed their doors for the weekend. I sat in Robert's office staring at the freshly printed stack of legally binding contracts. I was now holding the physical deeds to Richard's commercial properties, the titles to his fleet of luxury vehicles, and the collateral agreements for his extravagant personal estate. Richard had used my stolen $400,000 to try and make a small dent in his arrears, completely unaware that his payments were now legally owed directly to me. I had just become the Kensington family's largest and most powerful creditor. I owned them. Every time Richard bought an expensive cigar, every time Megan swiped her designer credit card to buy a new handbag, they were doing it on my dime. I held the absolute, indisputable power to foreclose on their entire pathetic existence whenever I chose. They thought they were the predators circling a wounded animal, but they had just willingly walked right into a steel cage. I folded the heavy debt portfolios and placed them securely into my leather briefcase. Just as I was shaking Robert's hand to leave the office, my cell phone vibrated violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw Kendrick's name flashing aggressively on the screen. I signaled for Robert to remain completely quiet, took a deep breath to steady my heart rate, and answered the call. "Hello, Kendrick," I said, keeping my voice appropriately weak, raspy, and thoroughly exhausted. "Dad," Kendrick responded. His tone was obnoxiously cheerful, but I could easily hear the underlying tension gripping his throat. Listen, I know you have not been feeling well lately. Your memory has been slipping. You have been repeating yourself, and you took that bad fall in the hallway the other day. Megan and I are just really worried about your overall health and cognitive state. I rolled my eyes at the ceiling, feeling a surge of pure disgust at his rehearsed lies. I am fine, Kendrick. Just a little tired from the changing weather, I replied mildly. Well, we are not taking any chances with your safety, he insisted, dropping the cheerful act and shifting to a firm, commanding tone that left no room for argument. I have already scheduled a comprehensive medical evaluation for you tomorrow morning. I am driving over to pick you up at 9 sharp. It is just a general health checkup with a private specialist to make sure everything is functioning properly in your head. You need to be washed, dressed, and ready to go. The line went dead before I could respond. I lowered the phone from my ear, a grim, calculated smile spreading slowly across my face. A private specialist. I knew exactly what this was. This was not a routine physical. This was the corrupt, heavily bribed doctor they had secured to officially sign my medical certificate of mental incompetence. The trap was finally springing shut, but they were the ones standing on the wrong side of the tripwire. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, the front door rattled as Kendrick unlocked it with his spare key. He did not come alone. Following closely behind him was a tall, excessively groomed white man carrying a sleek leather medical bag. This was the so-called private specialist. I was sitting in my worn armchair by the window wearing a faded, mismatched flannel shirt, buttoned entirely wrong. I had spent the last hour practicing the vacant, hollow stare of a man whose mind was slipping into the dark. When they walked into the living room, I did not look up. I just kept staring blankly at the dust motes dancing in the morning sunlight. Dad Kendrick announced, his voice carrying that same fake, overly patient tone. This is Dr. Evans. He is here to do a quick checkup on you. Make sure your memory is holding up. The doctor approached me with a predatory smile. Good morning, Nelson. Can you tell me what year it is? I let my hands tremble violently against the armrests. I forced my breathing to become shallow and erratic. Year, I mumbled, slurring the syllable. It is 1998. Diane is making soup. I looked past the doctor and locked my eyes on Kendrick, narrowing them in feigned, panicked confusion. Who is that man? I asked, pointing a shaking, arthritic finger directly at my own flesh and blood. Why is he in my house? Where is Marcus? Kendrick let out a heavy, incredibly dramatic sigh for the doctor's benefit. Dad, it is me. Kendrick. Your son. Marcus has been dead for 20 years. I shrank back into my chair, whimpering softly, shaking my head. No. I do not know you. Get out. The sheer audacity of the entire charade made my blood boil beneath my fragile, trembling exterior. Dr. Evans did not pull out a stethoscope. He did not check my blood pressure, my heart rate, or my pupils. He did not ask me a single legitimate diagnostic question or attempt to ground me in reality. Any real medical professional would have immediately recognized that my performance was a caricature, a desperate exaggeration of cognitive decline. But Dr. Evans was not here to practice medicine. He was here to fulfill a highly lucrative business transaction. He looked down at me, a sickening, dismissive smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth. He actually found my supposed degradation amusing. It is clear we are dealing with severe rapid-onset dementia, Dr. Evans declared, turning to Kendrick with absolute manufactured certainty. He is entirely disoriented. He poses a massive danger to himself living alone in this large property. He lacks the capacity to make basic personal or financial decisions. I watched through half-closed, shaking eyelids as the doctor opened his leather bag and pulled out a thick stack of official pre-printed medical forms. He uncapped a gold fountain pen and without a single shred of hesitation or moral conflict began signing his name across the bottom of the pages. He was signing away my fundamental human rights. He was legally stripping a sane, healthy 69-year-old man of his autonomy, his property, and his dignity. The rage burning inside my chest was a white-hot inferno. My son stood there watching a corrupt stranger erase his father from legal existence, and Kendrick looked absolutely thrilled. I let out a low, pathetic moan and let my head loll to the side, pretending to fall into a state of deep, unresponsive exhaustion. Kendrick and Dr. Evans immediately stepped away from my armchair, moving toward the kitchen island to finalize their despicable transaction. They assumed I was completely checked out, lost in a fog of senility. They had no idea they were standing directly in the center of the kill zone. I had strategically placed one of the ultra-high-definition motion-activated micro-cameras inside the digital clock on the microwave, giving it a crystal-clear, unobstructed view of the entire kitchen counter. As they stood there, Kendrick reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, bulging manila envelope. The shape and density of it left zero doubt about what was inside. It was cold hard, untraceable cash. "You have no idea how much of a relief this is, Dr. Evans," Kendrick said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was being perfectly recorded by the military-grade microphone taped beneath the marble island. "My father-in-law recommended you highly. He said you knew how to cut through the red tape." Dr. Evans took the envelope, weighing it in his hand with a greedy, practiced efficiency. "Richard Kensington is a good friend," the doctor replied smoothly, slipping the cash into his medical bag alongside the fraudulent diagnostic paperwork. "Tell him I appreciate the referral, and do not worry about the courts. My medical evaluations are ironclad. The judge will grant you full emergency guardianship by the end of the week. You will have total control over the estate." I lay perfectly still in my chair, listening to the sickening exchange of my freedom for a stack of stolen dollar bills. They were so arrogant, so utterly confident in their invincibility, that they did not even bother to lower their voices properly. They thought they had just committed the perfect, victimless crime. They thought the old, broken man in the living room was entirely oblivious to his own execution. But the high-resolution camera hidden across the room was capturing every single frame. It recorded the exact moment the bribe changed hands. It captured the crisp audio of their explicit criminal intent. It documented the undeniable connection between my son, a corrupt medical professional, and Richard Kensington. I had them dead to rights. Their conspiracy was no longer just a theory. It was an objective digital fact securely uploaded to my encrypted cloud server. Kendrick escorted the doctor out the front door, shaking his hand one final time before the man drove away. My son then walked back into the living room, staring down at me with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "You brought this on yourself, old man," Kendrick muttered under his breath, thinking I could not comprehend a single word. "If you had just given us the house when we asked, we would not have had to do it the hard way." He turned on his heel and walked out of the house, pulling the heavy front door shut until the deadbolt clicked into place. The moment I heard his car tires roll off the driveway, I stopped shaking. I sat up straight, rolled my shoulders back, and let out a deep, steadying breath. I walked into the kitchen, opened my phone, and reviewed the footage. It was flawless. Every word, every transaction, every smirk was captured in undeniable prosecuting detail, just as I saved the video files to a secure backup drive. My phone buzzed on the marble countertop. It was a highly encrypted text message from Robert Pierce. The notification illuminated the screen, bringing a cold, victorious smile to my face. I opened the message and read the words that would officially mark the beginning of their absolute destruction. "Phoenix Holdings has fully secured the debt contracts," Robert wrote. "The legal transfers are completely finalized and recorded with the state. We now own every single financial obligation Richard Kensington has in this world. You hold the leash, Nelson. You can legally foreclose on the Kensington family at any second." Less than 48 hours after the corrupt doctor left my house, the front door swung open again. Kendrick and Megan marched into my living room carrying a sleek leather portfolio. They moved with a hurried, nervous energy, the kind of frantic pace you see in desperate criminals right before a heist is completed. I was sitting on the sofa, maintaining the hollow, defeated posture of a man rapidly losing his grip on reality. Kendrick sat down next to me, forcefully placing the heavy portfolio on the coffee table directly above my hidden microphone. He opened it, revealing a thick stack of dense legal documents with brightly colored sticky notes attached to the signature lines. "Dad, we have some critically important paperwork for you to fill out today," Kendrick said, his voice dripping with that manufactured patronizing patience. "Dr. Evans said your Medicare coverage needs to be immediately updated to cover the new treatments and the assisted living facility we discussed. These are just standard health insurance renewal forms." He slid a sleek silver pen across the table toward my shaking hands. "All you have to do is sign where the sticky notes indicate, and Megan will rush them over to the insurance office before they close for the weekend. It will guarantee you get the best medical care possible." I stared down at the documents. The bold, capitalized header at the very top of the page was partially obscured by a strategically placed folder flap, but I did not need to see it to know exactly what it was. It was a quitclaim deed. It was a legally binding real estate transfer agreement. They were not renewing my health insurance. They were deliberately tricking a supposedly senile old man into signing over the total ownership of a $1.2 million property. I looked up from the fraudulent deed and stared directly into my son's eyes. I searched his face for any fleeting sign of hesitation, any microscopic trace of guilt or moral conflict regarding what he was doing. There was absolutely nothing. His gaze was cold hard and entirely focused on the ink pen sitting on the table. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal hit me with a profound, suffocating weight. I was not looking at my child anymore. I was looking at a ruthless predator who wore my son's face. My mind flashed back to the day Diane and I brought him home from the hospital. I remembered holding his tiny hand, making a silent vow to the universe that I would break my own back to ensure he never knew the crushing weight of poverty. I spent 40 years inhaling concrete dust, climbing steel scaffolding in the blistering Atlanta heat, and sacrificing every personal comfort I ever wanted, all to build this exact house and secure his future. And here he was, sitting in the very living room I built with my bare, calloused hands deliberately attempting to throw me out onto the street. He was actively participating in a scheme to strip away my dignity, declare me mentally incompetent, and lock me away in a decaying state-funded nursing home just to fund his wife's bankrupt family. The emotional pain was a sharp, jagged blade scraping against my ribs, but I did not let a single ounce of that agony show on my face. Grief had no place in this room. Grief is for the dead. I was very much alive, and I was currently holding the trigger to a massive legal bomb that was about to obliterate their entire existence. I let my hands begin to shake violently. I reached out for the silver pen, intentionally knocking it against the table twice before clumsily wrapping my fingers around the barrel. "My vision is so blurry today, Kendrick," I mumbled, squinting hard at the pages and letting my voice waver with artificial frailty. "The words are just swimming around the page." "What did you say this was for again?" "It is for your health insurance," Dad Megan interrupted sharply. Her polite facade was rapidly cracking under the intense pressure of her own blinding greed. She leaned over, tapping her manicured fingernail aggressively against the primary signature line. "You need to sign it right now so we can get your medical care approved. Do not worry about reading the fine print. Kendrick already verified everything. Just sign your name." I nodded slowly, playing the part of the obedient, confused elder to absolute perfection. I lowered the pen to the paper, but I did not sign my normal signature. Decades of executing massive commercial construction contracts had taught me a great deal about corporate law, and my attorney, Robert Pierce, had taught me the rest. When we initially discovered the forged power of attorney at the bank, Robert and I anticipated that Kendrick would eventually try to force me to sign physical property transfers. So Robert and I officially registered a secondary, highly classified signature profile with the state legal registry. We established a formal duress signature. It was a specific, legally documented variation of my handwriting designed exclusively to be used if I was ever held hostage, blackmailed, or coerced into signing binding contracts against my free will. My normal everyday signature was a flowing, connected Nelson Wright. But the signature I carved into their fraudulent deed was deliberately and systematically altered. I completely disconnected the first and last name, reversed the natural slant of the letters, and added a highly specific looped middle initial that I never naturally used. To the untrained eye of an arrogant, impatient thief, it simply looked like the messy, trembling scrawl of an exhausted old man. But to a federal judge or a forensic handwriting expert, that specific loop was a screaming, registered distress signal. It legally voided the entire document the exact second the ink dried, and it simultaneously classified the entire transaction as an active crime scene. I dragged the pen across the page, carefully executing the duress signature on all 3 designated lines. I let out a heavy, dramatic sigh as I finished, letting the pen roll out of my trembling hand and clatter loudly onto the hardwood floor. Before I could even lean back into the sofa cushions, Megan lunged forward. She aggressively snatched the documents right off the coffee table, clutching the freshly signed deed to her chest like a prized trophy. She did not even bother to say thank you or pretend to care about my well-being anymore. The mask of the caring daughter-in-law completely disintegrated, revealing the vicious, calculating fraud underneath. She looked down at me, a cruel, mocking smirk twisting her lips. "You did great, Nelson," she said, her voice dripping with triumphant venom. "Now you can just relax. We are going to pack up a few of your old clothes tomorrow, and then you can go enjoy your new room at the nursing home. You will not have to worry about this big, expensive house ever again." Kendrick stood up quickly, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. He firmly refused to meet my gaze, staring instead at the front door. "Let us go, Megan," he muttered anxiously. "We need to file these downtown before the county clerk's office closes for the weekend." They turned and marched out of my house, practically vibrating with greedy excitement. The heavy front door slammed shut behind them, leaving me alone in the sudden quiet of my living room. I sat perfectly still on the sofa, listening to their car engine start and speed away down the street. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. Megan and Kendrick thought they had just outsmarted an old, defenseless man. They genuinely believed they had legally stolen a $1.2 million property. What they did not realize was that real estate fraud targeting a senior citizen utilizing falsified medical documents and coerced signatures was not a simple civil dispute. It was a severe, high-level federal felony that carried mandatory prison time. Megan had just snatched up a piece of paper that was essentially a one-way ticket to federal prison, and she was rushing downtown to gladly hand it over to the authorities herself. With the freshly signed, highly illegal quitclaim deed in their greedy hands, Kendrick and Megan did not waste a single second. Using the $400,000 they had fraudulently siphoned from the equity of my lifelong home, they immediately set out to fabricate their illusion of immense wealth. They did not use the stolen money to pay off Richard Kensington's suffocating corporate debts as they originally planned. Greed is a disease that makes people completely reckless, blinding them to their own impending ruin. Megan demanded immediate luxury, and Kendrick, ever the obedient puppet, happily obliged. Within 3 days of forging my signature, they signed a wildly expensive lease on a massive ultra-luxury penthouse in the heart of the Buckhead district. It was a sprawling, glass-walled monstrosity with panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline, private elevator access, and a monthly rent that rivaled a normal person's annual salary. They were using my blood and sweat to play pretend. I watched the financial alerts roll in through the hidden tracking Robert had established on the fraudulent mortgage account. They were hemorrhaging cash at an astonishing rate. They hired high-end interior decorators, ordered custom Italian furniture, and secured a premium catering company. They were organizing a massive, extravagant housewarming party to officially debut their new high society status to all of Richard's elite snobbish associates. They wanted to show the city of Atlanta that the Kensington Empire was thriving, completely unaware that their entire lavish lifestyle was being funded by an old black engineer they had just tried to condemn to a state-run asylum. The sheer audacity of them throwing a party with my stolen retirement funds while planning to lock me in a decaying medical facility fueled a fire in my chest that burned hotter than the Georgia sun. I did not sit in my house and stew in anger. Anger is an emotion for the powerless, and I was holding all the cards. I called Robert Pierce and told him it was time for Phoenix Holdings to make its next aggressive acquisition. We already held the toxic debt that could sink Richard Kensington, but I wanted absolute physical control over my son and his wicked bride. I told Robert to contact the real estate management firm that owned the Buckhead building. In the world of ultra-luxury real estate, almost everything has a price tag if you have the liquid capital to back it up. Through the impenetrable corporate veil of Phoenix Holdings, Robert bypassed the leasing office and went directly to the building's primary development group. Using the untraceable funds from Diane's secret $2 million trust, we made a highly aggressive all-cash offer to purchase the penthouse unit outright. The developers, eager for a rapid infusion of liquid capital in a fluctuating market, accepted the bid without hesitation. The legal transaction was processed quietly and efficiently through commercial channels. By Thursday afternoon, the title of the luxury penthouse was officially transferred. Kendrick and Megan thought they had secured a prestigious lease to elevate their social standing. They had no idea their lease agreement had just been legally assigned to a new property owner. Phoenix Holdings now owned the absolute rights to the penthouse. I was officially their landlord. I held the legal authority to terminate their residence, dictate their terms, and evict them onto the street at a moment's notice. They were decorating a glass cage that I held the only key to. I sat in my quiet study, staring at the physical deed to the Buckhead property, feeling a profound sense of justice aligning perfectly with my strategy. The following Monday, I walked out to my mailbox and found a thick, heavy envelope resting inside. It was made of premium textured cardstock, sealed with a ridiculous gold wax stamp bearing the Kensington family crest. I broke the wax seal and pulled out the invitation. It was an elaborate, excessively worded announcement for the grand housewarming gala hosted by Kendrick Wright and Megan Kensington. The card boasted about a night of champagne live jazz and an exclusive presentation regarding Richard Kensington's upcoming commercial development projects. Those were the exact development projects Richard intended to fund by eventually selling the very ground my house stood on. I stared at the elegant gold foil lettering running my calloused thumb over the expensive paper. The sheer, unadulterated disrespect required to send me an invitation to a party funded by my stolen wealth was almost hard to comprehend. Why would they even bother inviting the man they just legally defrauded and diagnosed as severely demented? The answer was incredibly simple, and it disgusted me. It was all about maintaining their pristine public image. Richard Kensington and his daughter needed to project the illusion of a perfectly blended, harmonious family to their wealthy investors. Having the groom's father absent from such a highly publicized social event would spark unwanted questions and potential rumors among the country club elite. They needed me there simply as a prop, a silent background character, to prove to their guests that everything was entirely normal. They expected me to show up in my old, worn-out clothes, smile blankly at the wealthy donors, and quietly validate their perfect narrative. They believed the heavy sedatives and the psychological manipulation had completely broken my spirit, rendering me a docile, confused old man who would simply do whatever he was told. I placed the gold foil invitation on my kitchen counter and let out a deep, rumbling laugh. The sound echoed off the walls of the home I had built and protected for 4 decades. They were inviting the very architect of their impending destruction straight into their newly purchased stronghold. It was the absolute perfect venue for my final strike. I spent the rest of the afternoon coordinating with Robert. We established a strict timeline for the night of the party. I was not going to simply walk in and cause a scene. I was going to execute a flawless, legally binding demolition of their entire fraudulent reality. Every document was prepped. Every piece of evidence was loaded onto a secure tablet. The trap was fully set, and the mice were eagerly preparing the cheese. Before I could even throw the envelope into the recycling bin, my cell phone rang. It was Kendrick. I cleared my throat, adopting my frail, confused persona, and answered the call. "Dad, you received the invitation in the mail today, right?" Kendrick asked. His voice was sharp, fast, and entirely devoid of any warmth or affection. "Yes, Kendrick, I received it," I mumbled weakly. "It looks very fancy. I'm not sure if I have the right clothes for something like this." Kendrick sighed heavily, sounding completely inconvenienced by my mere existence. "That is exactly why I am calling," he snapped. "Listen to me very carefully. You are going to attend this party because Megan's family expects you to be there for the photographs. But we have very important guests coming. High-profile investors, politicians, people who actually matter." I tightened my grip on the phone, letting him dig his grave deeper. "So here are the rules." Kendrick continued, his tone dripping with sheer humiliation. "You will wear a dark plain suit so you do not stand out. When you arrive, you will go straight to the kitchen area near the catering staff and you will stay there. Do not wander around the penthouse. Do not try to strike up conversations with Richard's friends, and for the love of God, do not talk about your old construction jobs. Just sit quietly, take the pictures when we ask you to, and do not embarrass my wife's family. Do you understand me? My own son was ordering me to hide in the shadows like a stray dog." I closed my eyes, letting the cold, calculating fury solidify every single one of my plans. "I understand perfectly, Kendrick," I whispered. "I will stay exactly where I belong." The night of the housewarming party arrived with a sickening display of stolen opulence. I did not enter the penthouse immediately. Instead, I stood in the private elevator vestibule watching the scene unfold through the cracked double doors. The space was utterly transformed. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the glittering Atlanta skyline, but the interior was blindingly extravagant. Crystal flutes clinked, a live jazz trio played in the corner, and the room was packed with the city's wealthy elite. Waiters circulated with silver platters of caviar and imported delicacies. At the center of it all stood Richard Kensington. He was positioned on a small raised platform near the grand piano, holding a microphone and soaking in the adoration of his investors. He wore a velvet dinner jacket and spoke with the booming, arrogant confidence of a man who believed he was completely untouchable. He was currently giving a speech about his brilliant new commercial development project, completely omitting the fact that it was secretly funded by a fraudulent home equity loan he stole from me. And then there was my son. Kendrick, the boy I had broken my back to put through college, was weaving through the crowd like an unpaid intern. He carried a silver tray of expensive champagne, rushing to refill the glasses of Richard's associates. He laughed nervously at their condescending jokes and practically bowed every time Richard motioned for him. He was completely pathetic. He had traded his dignity and his family for a seat at a table where he was clearly only valued as a servant. He was playing the role of the eager, submissive son-in-law, entirely blind to the fact that the people he was serving viewed him with utter contempt. My gaze shifted from my groveling son to his new wife. Megan was floating through the crowd, holding court among a group of wealthy socialites. She was draped in a custom, shimmering emerald evening gown that undoubtedly cost more than a reliable vehicle. Around her neck sat a heavy diamond pendant that caught the light with every arrogant toss of her head. She laughed loudly, pointing out the imported Italian marble countertops and the custom velvet furniture they had just purchased for the penthouse. Every time she gestured to a new luxury item, my stomach churned with a dark, heavy fury. I was not looking at a successful young woman. I was looking at a walking, talking receipt of my stolen life savings. That emerald dress was paid for by the sweat I poured into laying concrete foundations in the sweltering Georgia heat. Those diamonds were funded by the 40 years I spent skipping vacations and driving beat-up trucks so my family would have a safety net. She was wearing my retirement, parading my legacy around her neck while actively plotting to lock me inside a filthy, underfunded state asylum. She looked incredibly smug, completely convinced that she had executed the perfect crime. She thought the old senile black man was currently sitting quietly in his decaying house, heavily sedated and waiting to be discarded like garbage. The sheer disrespect was staggering, but it only crystallized my resolve. I watched her sip her premium champagne and smile for the cameras, sickened by the reality that my life's work was funding her vanity. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. It was time to pull the trigger and shatter their beautiful, stolen illusion into a million jagged pieces. I was ready to bring their entire fake empire crashing down. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit and signaled to the men standing silently behind me. I had completely ignored Kendrick's humiliating instructions. I did not wear a cheap dark suit, and I certainly was not going to hide in the kitchen. I was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue Armani suit that Robert had helped me select earlier that week. It was immaculate, projecting absolute power and undeniable authority. I pushed the heavy double doors wide open. They hit the wall with a resounding crack that instantly cut through the chatter of the party. The jazz trio stopped playing mid-note. The clinking of glasses ceased. Hundreds of heads turned toward the entrance. I stepped into the blinding light of the penthouse, standing tall and keeping my posture incredibly rigid. Walking squarely beside me was Robert Pierce, holding a thick leather briefcase containing every piece of evidence we had gathered. Flanking us on either side were two men in sharp, unassuming business attire. They were plainclothes detectives from the Financial Crimes Division of the Atlanta Police Department, completely briefed and ready to execute their warrants. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. The elite guests stared at me in shock, unsure of who I was or why I commanded such an intense presence. Richard Kensington froze on his podium, his arrogant smile melting into a mask of pure confusion and sudden dread. He lowered the microphone, staring at me as if a ghost had just walked through the front door. Kendrick was standing near the bar. The silver tray of champagne slipped from his hands, crashing onto the pristine hardwood floor and sending shattered glass flying everywhere. The sound echoed loudly in the dead quiet room. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, utterly failing to comprehend how the frail, demented old man he had left at home was currently standing in a designer suit with an entourage of law enforcement. I did not break eye contact with my son. I walked slowly and deliberately into the center of the room, the crowd instinctively parting to make way for me like the Red Sea. I felt the collective panic radiating from the Kensington family. Their perfectly constructed fraudulent reality was violently colliding with the severe, unforgiving truth. I stopped right in front of the grand piano, planting my feet firmly on the expensive imported rug. I was in total control of the room, and everyone present could feel the massive shift in power. They were trapped in a luxurious cage of their own making, and the lock had just clicked shut. The deafening silence was suddenly shattered by a shrill, furious shriek. Megan pushed her way through the crowd, her face twisted into an ugly mask of panic and rage. She marched toward me, her designer heels stomping aggressively against the floor. "What the hell are you doing here?" she screamed, completely abandoning her polite high society persona in front of all her prestigious guests. "You were supposed to stay at home. Who let you in here?" She turned wildly toward the security guard stationed near the private elevator. "Security. Get this crazy old man out of here right now. He is mentally unstable and he is trespassing. Throw him out onto the street." The guards took a hesitant step forward, unsure of how to handle the escalating situation given the presence of the plainclothes detectives standing right next to me. Robert stepped slightly in front of me, opening his leather briefcase to present his credentials, but I held up a hand to stop him. I did not need my lawyer to handle this specific moment. This was highly personal. I looked Megan up and down, taking in her stolen diamonds and her trembling, furious posture. I let out a low, cold laugh that echoed perfectly in the quiet room. The sheer audacity of her entitlement was almost comical. I took a deliberate step closer to her, lowering my voice so it carried a terrifying, icy weight that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. "Throw me out, Megan," I asked, tilting my head slightly. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out the crisp, legally certified property deed provided by the development group. "Where exactly are you planning to evict the owner of this building?" Megan dropped her jaw, her perfectly glossed lips parting in a silent gasp of pure shock. The furious redness in her cheeks instantly drained away, leaving her pale and trembling in her expensive emerald gown. She stared at the crisp, legally certified property deed in my hand, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The heavy paper bore the official embossed seal of the city of Atlanta and clearly listed my corporate holding company as the sole proprietor of the entire residential high-rise. Richard Kensington, who had been marching aggressively from his podium to back up his spoiled daughter, stopped dead in his tracks. The arrogant, untouchable swagger completely evaporated from his posture. He squinted at the document, his eyes widening as his brain violently struggled to process the irrefutable truth printed in bold black ink. The elite guests surrounding us began to whisper feverishly, their crystal champagne glasses lowered as they sensed the tectonic plates of power shifting drastically in the room. I held the deed up high enough for everyone to see, ensuring the city's wealthiest investors understood exactly who was currently holding the keys to the castle. "You see, Megan?" I continued, my voice entirely calm but carrying a lethal, uncompromising weight. "When you and my son decided to fraudulently drain my home equity to fund this ridiculous charade, you signed a lease agreement with a luxury development firm. What you failed to realize in your greedy haste was that real estate portfolios are frequently bought and sold by people with actual wealth. I purchased the entire leaseholding of this penthouse 3 days ago. I am not a trespassing guest in your home. You are a severely delinquent tenant standing in my property, and your lease is hereby terminated." Richard finally found his voice. He took a stumbling step forward, his face flushed with a dangerous, volatile mix of humiliation and rising panic. "This is an absolute outrage," he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. "You are a delusional, senile old man. There is absolutely no way a retired working-class construction engineer secured the capital to purchase a $50 million residential skyscraper. You are fabricating legal documents. Security, remove this pathetic fraud immediately." Robert Pierce stepped forward, opening his leather briefcase and pulling out a massive stack of perfectly bound legal contracts. He handed them directly to Richard, forcing the arrogant developer to physically take hold of his own destruction. "Nelson Wright is not just a retired engineer," Robert announced, projecting his voice so it carried easily to the furthest corners of the massive penthouse. "He is the sole owner and primary shareholder of Phoenix Holdings Incorporated." The whisper mill among the crowd instantly turned into a frantic, chaotic buzz. The wealthy investors in the room recognized the name Phoenix Holdings immediately. It was the massive, anonymous private equity firm that had been aggressively buying up distressed commercial assets all week. Richard stared down at the contracts in his hands, the color completely washing out of his face for the second time. His knees visibly buckled beneath his velvet dinner jacket. These were not just property deeds. They were the exact, highly confidential promissory notes he had defaulted on over the last year. "You bought my debt," Richard whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, terrified squeak. He looked up at me, pure unfiltered horror radiating from his eyes. "I did not just buy your debt, Richard," I replied, stepping directly into his personal space. "I bought your entire pathetic existence." I turned my back on Megan, dismissing her entirely, and focused my full, unyielding attention on the fraudulent king of the Kensington Empire. I made sure every single investor, socialite, and business partner in that room could hear my next words with absolute clarity. "You have been standing on that podium all night, Richard, boasting about your massive wealth and soliciting investments for a commercial development project you have absolutely zero capital to fund. You are nothing but a desperate, bankrupt predator drowning in a sea of toxic liabilities." I pointed to the contracts shaking violently in his hands. "Through Phoenix Holdings, I systematically purchased the entirety of your commercial and private loans. I hold the liens on your development sites, the titles to your luxury vehicles, and the collateral agreements for your personal estate. You owe my firm exactly $5.2 million. And because you are currently in severe documented default on every single one of those accounts, I am calling in the debts. All of them, immediately." The penthouse erupted in loud gasps. The wealthy elite who had just been drinking his champagne and considering his investment pitches began physically backing away from him, treating the Kensington family like a highly contagious disease. High society does not tolerate financial failure, and they certainly do not tolerate being scammed. Richard began to hyperventilate. The velvet dinner jacket he wore suddenly looked like a suffocating straitjacket. "You cannot do this," he gasped, clutching the legal papers to his chest. "You cannot call in $5 million overnight. It will completely ruin me. I will lose my business. I will lose my home." I stared at him with absolute zero-degree apathy. "That is precisely the point," I stated firmly. "You attempted to use my son to steal my lifelong home so you could save your own. You plotted to throw a 69-year-old man onto the street to fund your vanity. Now you are going to experience exactly what that feels like. You have exactly 24 hours to produce a certified wire transfer for the full $5.2 million. If the funds are not in the Phoenix Holdings account by tomorrow evening, my legal team will execute immediate foreclosure on every single asset attached to the Kensington name. We will liquidate your company, auction your estate, and leave you with absolutely nothing." Richard's eyes rolled back slightly. He dropped the legal contracts, his hands flying up to clutch violently at his chest. He let out a strained, wheezing gasp, staggering backward until he crashed heavily against the grand piano. He collapsed onto the piano bench, struggling to breathe as his perfectly constructed empire disintegrated in front of his wealthiest peers. Megan screamed, rushing over to fan her father, but no one else in the room moved to offer him a single shred of help. Then a sudden, frantic movement caught my eye. Kendrick shoved his way past the plainclothes detectives, his face twisted in desperate, furious denial. He stopped right in front of me, his fists clenched tight at his sides. "Do not listen to him," Kendrick shouted to the room, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. He pointed an accusing, trembling finger directly at my face. "My father is completely insane. He has severe dementia. We have medical proof. He does not know what he is doing. He is having a psychotic breakdown and hallucinating all of this business nonsense. He is mentally incompetent." I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply pulled a small digital remote control from my pocket and pointed it at the massive state-of-the-art media projector mounted above the main bar. The projector had been set up to display a romantic slideshow of Megan and Kendrick's wedding photos. I pressed a single button. The smiling wedding images vanished instantly. The enormous white wall behind the bar was suddenly illuminated with ultra-high-definition 4K video footage. The hidden camera angle from my kitchen microwave perfectly displayed Kendrick handing a thick, bulging envelope of cash to Dr. Evans. The pristine audio system, which had just been playing soft jazz, now broadcasted their criminal conspiracy at maximum volume. The entire penthouse listened in stunned, horrified silence as the corrupt doctor accepted the bribe, promising to provide ironclad, fraudulent medical evaluations to secure an emergency guardianship. My son's voice echoed through his own luxury apartment, laughing as he traded his father's freedom for a stack of dirty money. Kendrick froze completely, all the remaining blood draining from his face as he watched his own federal crimes broadcast to a room full of millionaires and police detectives. The high-definition video finished playing on the massive projector screen. The horrifying echo of Kendrick laughing as he handed a thick envelope of cash to a corrupt medical professional seemed to bounce off the glass walls of the penthouse forever. The absolute silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Then the panic immediately set in. The wealthy investors, socialites, and politicians did not just murmur, they actively scrambled. High society operates on a strict code of self-preservation, and absolutely no one wanted to be caught standing in a room hosted by a federal criminal. Women in designer gowns grabbed their husbands by the arm, practically sprinting toward the private elevators. Men in tailored tuxedos abandoned their crystal champagne glasses on any available surface, averting their eyes and rushing for the exits. The grand housewarming party rapidly disintegrated into a frantic, chaotic evacuation. Within a matter of seconds, the vast, luxurious room was entirely empty of guests, leaving only the catering staff cowering near the kitchen, my legal team, the police, and the shattered remains of the Kensington family. The two plainclothes detectives flanked me and stepped smoothly into the center of the room. They did not address Kendrick first. They walked straight past him and stopped directly in front of Richard Kensington, who was still slumped heavily against the grand piano bench, clutching his chest in a state of absolute ruin. Richard Kensington, the lead detective, announced, his voice carrying the firm, uncompromising weight of the law. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of felony financial fraud, wire fraud, and severe tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent." The detective pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The sharp metallic click of the cuffs locking around Richard's wrists rang out like a final death knell for the Kensington empire. Richard did not fight back. He simply stared blankly at the floor, his breathing ragged and shallow as the detectives hauled him roughly to his feet. Megan watched her arrogant father being dragged away in steel handcuffs. The sight of the patriarch falling from grace shattered whatever remaining composure she had left. Pure, unadulterated panic overtook her features. The instinct for absolute self-preservation kicked in, entirely overriding her fabricated loyalty to her new husband. Megan stumbled backward, her emerald gown catching on the edge of the glass coffee table. She threw her hands up in the air, physically distancing herself from Kendrick as if he were suddenly radioactive. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this," Megan shrieked, her voice echoing wildly across the empty penthouse. She pointed a frantic, trembling finger directly at my son. "It was all him. Kendrick did all of this. I did not know anything about a forged power of attorney or a fake medical diagnosis. He lied to me. He lied to my entire family. He told us his father was genuinely sick and that he had the legal right to use that retirement money." Kendrick stared at his wife in absolute disbelief, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process the sheer speed of her betrayal. "Megan, what are you talking about?" Kendrick stammered, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. "We planned this together. You were the one who found Dr. Evans. You told me we needed to secure the house before your father went bankrupt." "I did no such thing!" Megan screamed hysterically, tears of pure manipulation streaming down her meticulously contoured face. "You are a liar and a thief. You manipulated my family because you were desperate to fit into our world. You stole from your own father to buy this penthouse, and now you are trying to drag me down with you. I am a victim here." She turned to the detectives, her eyes wide with manufactured innocence, throwing the man she had just married entirely under the bus to save her own skin from federal prison. I watched her pathetic, desperate performance with absolute disgust. She was a master manipulator, but her lies were entirely useless against the mountain of evidence I had meticulously gathered. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, pulling a second, much thinner file folder from Robert's leather briefcase. "Really, Megan?" I asked, my voice slicing through her hysterical sobbing like a freezing blade. "You are claiming to be a completely innocent victim in all of this. You knew absolutely nothing about the plot to declare me mentally incompetent." Megan vigorously shook her head, tears ruining her expensive makeup. She swore she knew nothing. I smiled coldly. "Then I suppose it was not you who stood in my kitchen last week, explicitly instructing my son to crush heavy prescription sedatives into my daily meals so I would wander out into the street and collapse." I did not need to play the audio recording again. The exact quote hitting the air stripped the remaining color from her face. She clamped her mouth shut, her eyes darting frantically around the room looking for an escape that did not exist. "But the attempted poisoning is not even the most interesting part of your deception, Megan," I continued, opening the thin folder. "You see, when Phoenix Holdings absorbed your father's massive corporate debt, we also gained access to his private communication servers during the forensic accounting audit. We found a highly confidential, unfiled post-nuptial agreement draft that your father's lawyers were preparing. I pulled out a stack of printed emails and high-resolution photographs, tossing them onto the glass coffee table right in front of Kendrick. Megan was not just plotting to steal my house, Kendrick. She was plotting to completely discard you the exact second the funds cleared. You were never her husband. You were her temporary bank robber. I pointed the digital remote at the ceiling projector once again. The screen flashed, replacing the bribery video with a series of intercepted text messages and time-stamped photographs. The images showed Megan sitting in an intimate, highly romantic embrace with a wealthy, athletic white man at a private country club just 3 days before the wedding. The text messages displayed on the massive screen were completely damning. They were between Megan and the man in the photos. "I am only marrying him for the property equity," read one message sent from Megan's phone. "The old man's house is worth over $1 million. As soon as Kendrick secures the deed and liquidates the asset, I am filing for divorce and taking half the cash. We will be together in Paris by Christmas, I promise." Kendrick stood perfectly still, his eyes locked onto the massive projection screen. He read the text messages over and over again as if his brain was violently rejecting the information. He looked down at the photographs on the glass table, seeing his beautiful high society wife kissing another man just days before she walked down the aisle and promised him forever. The devastating, undeniable truth crashed down on him with the force of a falling skyscraper. Everything he believed about his life, his upward mobility, and his prestigious marriage was an absolute manufactured lie. Megan never loved him. She never respected him. She and her bankrupt father had targeted him solely because he was an insecure, desperate fool willing to sell out his own flesh and blood for a taste of their elite lifestyle. Kendrick had willingly committed severe federal felonies, stolen my life savings, and actively plotted to lock me inside a decaying state asylum, all for a woman who viewed him as a disposable, highly gullible pawn. The crushing weight of his reality finally broke him. Kendrick's knees gave out. He collapsed onto the pristine hardwood floor of his stolen luxury penthouse, landing hard on his hands and knees. He let out a gut-wrenching, agonizing sob that echoed off the glass walls. He had traded a father who loved him, who sacrificed 40 years of his life to provide for him, for a family of parasites who were planning to throw him in the trash the moment his usefulness expired. His entire world was completely annihilated. He was going to federal prison. His marriage was a humiliating scam, and he had absolutely no one left to save him. I stood tall in my tailored suit, looking down at my broken son weeping on the floor. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I only felt the cold, hard satisfaction of absolute justice being served. Kendrick remained on the hardwood floor, his tailored suit wrinkling as his body heaved with violent, pathetic sobs. The reality of his situation had entirely paralyzed him. He was a man who had traded his soul for a counterfeit dream, and now he was left with absolutely nothing. Megan, however, was possessed by a completely different instinct. She did not mourn her marriage or the destruction of her family's empire. She only cared about her own survival. Her eyes darted wildly around the vast, empty penthouse. Realizing that the plainclothes detectives were currently occupied with securing her father, she saw a fleeting window of opportunity. She hitched up the heavy skirt of her custom emerald gown and bolted toward the private elevator vestibule. Her diamond heels struck the marble tiles in a frantic, panicked rhythm. She was attempting to abandon her husband and her father, hoping to slip into the Atlanta night and disappear before the legal net fully closed around her. But her escape was embarrassingly short-lived. As she reached out to aggressively pound the elevator call button, the heavy double doors swung open. 2 uniformed Atlanta police officers stepped directly into her path, their imposing figures completely blocking the exit. Megan slammed on the brakes, nearly twisting her ankle as she stumbled backward. "Where do you think you are going, ma'am?" one of the officers asked, his tone completely devoid of sympathy. Megan opened her mouth to scream, to demand her release, to use the wealthy, privileged indignation that had protected her for her entire life. But the words died in her throat. She was no longer a protected socialite. She was an active suspect in a massive federal fraud investigation, and there was absolutely nowhere left for her to run. Megan slowly backed away from the uniformed officers, her chest heaving as she retreated into the main living area. She looked like a trapped animal. Robert Pierce stepped forward, commanding the attention of the room with the effortless authority of a seasoned litigator. He opened a fresh, legally binding document from his briefcase. "Megan Kendrick, I highly suggest you pay attention," Robert announced, his voice slicing through Kendrick's pathetic weeping. "As the primary legal counsel representing Phoenix Holdings and Nelson Wright, I have spent the last 48 hours coordinating directly with federal banking authorities. The $400,000 you fraudulently extracted from my client's home equity is officially classified as stolen capital. Therefore, any accounts, assets, or lines of credit associated with that money are now frozen. Megan sneered, crossing her arms defensively. You cannot do that. We have our own money. My credit cards are under my name. Robert offered a cold, clinical smile. Actually, Megan, you do not have your own money. The forensic audit proved that your personal accounts were entirely subsidized by the stolen mortgage funds and your father's heavily defaulted loans. 10 minutes ago, a federal judge signed an emergency asset freeze. Every single credit card in your wallet, every joint checking account, and every investment portfolio tied to your name has been completely disabled. You currently have zero access to liquid capital. You cannot withdraw cash. You cannot charge a hotel room. You cannot even buy a cup of coffee. Your financial existence has been completely erased. Megan frantically reached into her designer clutch, pulling out her platinum credit card and staring at it as if it had magically turned to dust. The reality of true, inescapable poverty was finally hitting her. I stepped forward, taking my rightful place beside my attorney. I looked around the sprawling, beautifully decorated penthouse. The custom Italian leather sofas, the imported marble dining table, the ridiculous crystal chandeliers. It was a monument to their unchecked greed. As the legal owner of this property through Phoenix Holdings, I have one final piece of business to conduct tonight, I stated, ensuring my voice resonated with absolute finality. Your lease was legally terminated the exact moment my firm purchased this building. You are currently trespassing on my private property. I looked down at Kendrick, who was slowly lifting his tear-stained face from the floor, and then over to Megan, who was still clutching her useless credit cards. I am issuing an immediate, unconditional eviction order, I declared. You have exactly 1 hour to pack your personal belongings and vacate these premises. Megan's jaw dropped in absolute outrage. 1 hour, she shrieked, her voice echoing wildly. You cannot legally do this. We have tenant rights. We have furniture. It takes months to evict someone. Robert Pierce smoothly intervened, shutting down her desperate protest with cold legal reality. You forfeit standard tenant protections when you secure a luxury lease using criminally obtained fraudulent funds, Robert explained calmly. This is not a standard civil eviction. This is the reclamation of an active crime scene. You are incredibly lucky. My client is allowing you to pack a bag instead of having you escorted out in handcuffs immediately alongside your father. I pulled a sleek, heavy silver pocket watch from my suit jacket, checked the time, and snapped it shut. You now have 59 minutes, I said, looking directly at Megan and then down at my son. You may take your clothing and your basic personal toiletries. Every single piece of furniture, every electronic device, and every luxury item purchased with my stolen money stays exactly where it is. That includes the jewelry around your neck, Megan. If you attempt to steal anything on your way out, the officer standing by the elevator will arrest you for additional theft. Megan looked wildly around the room, realizing her luxurious fantasy was entirely over. She let out a frustrated, defeated scream, unclasped the heavy diamond pendant from her neck, threw it onto a glass table, and stomped aggressively down the hallway toward the master bedroom. She began frantically searching for empty suitcases. She was going to grab whatever designer dresses she could carry and figure out how to survive on the streets of Atlanta without a dime to her name. While Megan was tearing through the master bedroom, throwing her expensive clothes into luggage, Kendrick remained completely stationary in the center of the living room. The reality of his absolute ruin was finally sinking into his bones. His father-in-law was being hauled off to a federal holding cell. His beautiful high society wife had just publicly declared she was only using him for his stolen money and was planning to divorce him. His credit cards were frozen, and he was being thrown out of his home with absolutely nowhere to go. He had severely underestimated the man who raised him, and he had lost everything in the process. Kendrick slowly pushed himself up from the floor, but he did not stand. Instead, he crawled across the expensive imported rug, dragging his knees over the pristine fabric. He moved toward me like a broken, defeated animal. He reached out with trembling, sweaty hands and violently wrapped his arms around my right leg. He buried his face against my trousers, his tears soaking through the fabric. "Dad." "Please," Kendrick wailed, his voice a pathetic, agonizing screech. "Please do not do this to me. I am sorry. I am so sorry. They manipulated me. Megan and Richard, they got into my head. They made me feel like I was not good enough. They told me I needed to secure my future. I was stupid. I was weak. But I am your son. You are my father. You cannot throw me out onto the street. Please, Dad, I have nothing left. Save me. Please save me." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the grown man sobbing uncontrollably at my feet. The entire room fell dead silent, waiting to see if a father's love would ultimately override his demand for absolute justice. I looked down at the top of Kendrick's head, feeling the desperate, frantic grip of his hands around my leg. The damp warmth of his tears soaked through the wool of my trousers, a pathetic display of a man who had finally hit the concrete floor of reality. A year ago, a month ago, even a week ago, the sight of my only child in such profound agony would have broken my heart. It would have driven me to my knees to pull him into a tight embrace and shield him from whatever storm was threatening to pull him under. But as I stood there in the center of that gaudy, stolen penthouse, I searched the deepest corners of my soul and found absolutely nothing. There was not a single tear welling in my eyes. There was not a single ounce of pity left in my heart. The biological connection that had once bound me to this man had been violently severed the moment I heard him laughing with a corrupt doctor about locking me away in a decaying facility. I stared down at his shaking shoulders, viewing him not as my flesh and blood, but as a highly dangerous parasite that had finally been excised from my life. He was crying because he had been caught, not because he was genuinely remorseful for attempting to destroy my existence. He was mourning the loss of his stolen wealth, his fake prestige, and his luxury apartment. He was not mourning the destruction of our family. I slowly reached down, firmly gripping his wrists with my calloused hands. I peeled his sweaty fingers off my leg with the same detached mechanical precision I would use to remove a rusted, useless bolt from a steel beam. I took a deliberate step backward, forcing him to collapse forward onto the empty space where I had just been standing. Kendrick looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot. He reached out a trembling hand, grasping at empty air. "Dad," he choked out, his voice a pathetic rasp. "Please, I am your son." I shook my head slowly, keeping my posture incredibly rigid and my voice dangerously cold. "No," I stated, letting the absolute finality of the word echo through the silent room. "You are not my son." The son Diane and I raised was taught the value of honest labor, the sanctity of family, and the heavy responsibility of protecting his elders. That boy died a long time ago, suffocated by his own pathetic desperation to impress a room full of arrogant strangers who never respected him in the first place. You are just a cowardly thief wearing his face. Kendrick let out a sharp, wounded gasp, scrambling backward on the rug. "But they made me do it," he pleaded, pointing a shaking finger toward the hallway where Megan was frantically packing. "They told me you were going to lose the house anyway." I did not raise my voice, but the sheer icy fury in my tone made him physically flinch. "Do not dare insult my intelligence by playing the victim," I commanded. "Richard and Megan did not force you to drain 40 years of my blood and sweat from my retirement account. They did not hold a gun to your head when you forged my signature on a federal banking document. And they certainly did not force you to sit in my living room and actively plot to poison my food with heavy mind-altering sedatives so you could toss me into a state asylum. My son would never poison his own father. You made your choices, Kendrick. Now you will survive the consequences." I turned my body, slightly breaking eye contact with the weeping man on the floor, and gave a brief, decisive nod to Robert Pierce. My attorney immediately turned to the plainclothes detectives who had just finished coordinating the secure transport of Richard Kensington. "Gentlemen," Robert announced with sharp, professional authority, "you have the verified security footage, the forged quitclaim deed, and the authenticated banking records. I believe we are entirely finished here." The lead financial crimes detective stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the imported hardwood floor. He reached to the back of his belt and unclipped a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "Kendrick Wright," the detective stated, his voice devoid of any emotion, "you are officially under arrest. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Kendrick remained frozen on the floor, shaking his head in absolute panicked denial. No, you cannot arrest me," he stammered frantically, looking between the detective and me. "I gave the money back. The house is still his. You cannot do this." I did not say a single word. I simply watched as the two officers grabbed Kendrick by the arms and hauled him roughly to his feet. They spun him around forcefully, pinning his arms behind his tailored suit jacket. The sharp metallic snap of the handcuffs locking into place was the most satisfying sound I had heard in months. "You are being charged with multiple counts of first-degree bank fraud, aggravated forgery, and severe elder financial abuse," the detective recited, spinning Kendrick around to face the reality of his future. "Furthermore, based on the surveillance audio detailing your intent to administer non-prescribed heavy sedatives, You are also being charged with conspiracy to commit bodily harm." Kendrick let out a hollow, defeated wail, his chin dropping to his chest as the sheer weight of the federal felonies crushed whatever remaining fight he had left in him. Down the hallway, the bedroom door swung open. 2 uniformed officers escorted Megan into the living room. She was clutching a single, overflowing designer suitcase. Her face was stained with mascara, and her wrists were already securely fastened in handcuffs. She glared at Kendrick with pure, unadulterated hatred, blaming him for her spectacular fall from grace. He refused to even look at her. The elite high society couple that had tried to bury me alive was now standing in their stolen penthouse bound in steel and completely stripped of their fraudulent wealth. The detectives firmly gripped Kendrick and Megan by the arms, marching them forward in a humiliating procession of total defeat. I stood perfectly still, watching them being paraded toward the private elevator vestibule. Neither of them looked back. The heavy metal doors slid open, swallowing them whole, and then slid shut, effectively erasing them from my life. A moment later, the distinct piercing wail of police sirens erupted from the busy Buckhead streets far below. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the surrounding glass skyscrapers, painting the night sky with the undeniable colors of ultimate justice. They were being hauled away to a federal holding facility, trading their panoramic city views for a concrete cell and a steel toilet. I turned around and slowly surveyed the massive, completely desolate penthouse. The extravagant housewarming party was entirely dead. Half-eaten caviar rested on silver platters. Expensive champagne had spilled across the marble countertops, dripping steadily onto the pristine hardwood floors. The glittering crystal chandeliers shone down on an empty, silent room that had been deliberately designed to celebrate my destruction. It was a beautiful hollow tomb. I felt a profound, heavy weight physically lift from my shoulders. The toxic rot that had infected my family was finally excised from my world. I raised my hands, slowly dusting off my palms as if brushing away years of accumulated dirt and grime. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored midnight blue suit, buttoned my jacket, and walked out the front door without a single glance over my shoulder. The morning after the penthouse raid, I woke up in my own bed with a clarity I had not felt in years. The air in my house felt lighter, completely cleansed of the toxic presence that had tried to suffocate me. But my work was not entirely finished. Kendrick and Megan were sitting in a federal holding cell, but a massive, fraudulent $400,000 lien still technically hovered over my property. I drank a single cup of black coffee, put on a sharp gray suit, and drove straight to the towering glass headquarters of the commercial bank that had carelessly approved their fraudulent loan. Robert Pierce was already waiting for me in the massive marble lobby, his trusty leather briefcase firmly in hand. We did not bother stopping at the front reception desk to ask for an appointment. We walked with the undeniable authority of men who owned the building, pushing past the glass partitions and heading straight for the executive lending suites on the top floor. We barged directly into the corner office of the regional vice president of lending, a slick-looking corporate banker who immediately dropped his phone in shock as we invaded his space. He stood up, sputtering about security and scheduled meetings, but Robert simply slammed the door shut behind us and locked it. I sat down in one of the plush leather chairs opposite his massive mahogany desk, crossing my legs and staring the executive down until he slowly sank back into his seat. "We are not here to schedule a friendly chat," I stated, my voice echoing off his pristine office walls. "We are here to dismantle a catastrophic legal failure that your branch authorized, and you are going to fix it right now." The vice president adjusted his expensive silk tie, trying to regain his corporate composure. He demanded to know who we were and what we wanted. Robert did not waste a single breath on pleasantries. He unclasped his briefcase and pulled out the authenticated copies of the quitclaim deed and the home equity loan approval documents that the bank had rushed through just days prior. Robert slid them aggressively across the polished wood desk. "You personally approved a $400,000 equity line of credit against my client's fully paid property," Robert declared sharply. "You authorized the immediate transfer of those funds to a third-party corporate account owned by Richard Kensington, based entirely on this single document." The banker glanced at the papers, rolling his eyes as if we were wasting his valuable time. "We processed this loan because it was accompanied by a notarized power of attorney and a signed property deed," the executive replied defensively. "Everything on our end was completely by the book. It is not our responsibility to mediate internal family financial disputes." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on his desk. "Look very closely at the signature on that deed," I commanded softly. "Look at the disconnected letters. Look at the reversed slant. Look at the highly specific loop on the middle initial." The banker frowned, leaning in to inspect the ink. "It looks like the shaky handwriting of an elderly man," he muttered dismissively. I smiled a cold, unforgiving smile. "It is a registered, legally classified duress signature," I explained. "It is a specific variation of my handwriting officially filed with the state registry, designed explicitly to signal that I was being coerced under threat. Your underwriter completely failed to flag a glaring legal distress signal." The color rapidly drained from the vice president's face. The arrogant corporate shield he was hiding behind instantly began to crack. He pulled the document closer to his face, his eyes darting frantically over the abnormal loops and jagged lines of the signature. "You are holding a highly illegal, fraudulent document that your bank used to strip a 69-year-old man of his lifelong home," Robert added, turning the legal screws even tighter. My client was actively being targeted by a federal fraud ring. "The individuals who filed this paperwork with your office were arrested by federal agents last night." The banker swallowed hard beads of sweat suddenly forming on his forehead. "Listen," he stammered, raising his hands in a defensive gesture. The bank was completely unaware of any criminal conspiracy. "We process hundreds of these applications a week. We cannot possibly be held liable for catching a hidden duress signature if the notary stamp was falsified." I stood up from the leather chair, planting my hands firmly on his desk and towering over him. "Do not dare insult my intelligence by playing the victim of circumstance," I warned, my voice dropping to a dangerous low rumble. "Your loan officers bypassed standard verification protocols because they saw a massive lucrative transaction tied to Richard Kensington, a wealthy white developer they wanted to please. You completely neglected your fiduciary duty to protect a vulnerable senior citizen because you were chasing a commission bonus." The banker opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off instantly. "You have two choices today," I stated flatly. "Choice number one is that you immediately void this loan, erase the lien on my property, and absorb the $400,000 loss yourselves. Choice number two is that I walk out of this office and drive straight to the headquarters of the local news networks. I will sit in front of a television camera and tell the entire state of Georgia how this bank happily colluded with a corrupt developer to steal a black man's legacy home. I will file a massive civil lawsuit for gross negligence and elder financial abuse that will cost this institution millions in legal fees and utterly destroy your public relations." The executive sat frozen in his chair, staring at me with absolute terror. He knew I was not bluffing. He picked up his desk phone with a trembling hand and called his legal compliance department. Within 20 minutes, the entire $400,000 mortgage was officially declared null and void. The lien on my property was permanently erased. My house was completely mine again. I walked out of the towering glass bank building into the bright Atlanta sunlight, feeling the warm Georgia air fill my lungs. I had successfully defended the walls of my home, but there was still one final piece of the puzzle missing. As Robert and I walked toward our vehicles, his cell phone rang with a secure incoming call from the Federal Asset Forfeiture Division. Robert answered, listening intently for a few moments before a wide, genuine smile broke across his face. He hung up the phone and turned to me. "Nelson," he announced, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Because Phoenix Holdings aggressively triggered the total bankruptcy and foreclosure of Richard Kensington's entire corporate estate, federal agents seized all of his remaining liquid assets this morning. During the seizure, they located the exact accounts holding your stolen retirement funds. Since your money was officially classified as stolen capital linked to an active criminal investigation, the feds have prioritized its immediate return." I let out a slow, deeply satisfying breath. The $150,000 Kendrick had so casually stolen to pay for his absurd wedding was being wired directly back into my secure, newly protected bank account. I had successfully recovered every single dime, every square foot of property, and every ounce of dignity they had attempted to steal from me. My life was entirely whole again, completely untouched by their malicious greed. I had won the war. But the story of their destruction was not quite over. Recovering my wealth was simply closing the chapter on my own survival. The next chapter belonged to the justice system. 3 months later, I found myself sitting in the front row of a heavily guarded federal courtroom, watching the people who betrayed me finally face the ultimate crushing consequences of their actions. 3 months later, I found myself sitting in the front row of a heavily guarded federal courtroom in downtown Atlanta. The air conditioning was turned up high, but the chill in the room came entirely from the absolute destruction of the Kensington family. The wheels of federal justice turn slowly, but when they finally grind forward, they crush everything in their path. Richard Kensington stood before the federal judge looking like a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant billionaire he once pretended to be. His tailored velvet jackets had been replaced by a baggy, bright orange prison jumpsuit. His silver hair was unkempt and his shoulders slumped under the massive weight of the reality he could no longer buy his way out of. The judge did not mince words. He meticulously listed Richard's extensive crimes, highlighting the millions of dollars defrauded from private investors and the deliberate targeting of vulnerable individuals to artificially inflate his failing empire. The gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, heavy crack. Richard was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. He simply hung his head and let the marshals lead him away. Megan was next. She stood at the defense table, weeping loudly and trying to play the delicate, manipulated victim one last time. But the federal prosecutors had secured the unedited surveillance audio of her actively instructing her husband to poison my food with heavy sedatives. The judge looked down at her with undisguised contempt, noting that her greed had crossed the line from financial fraud into attempted physical harm against a senior citizen. Despite her expensive defense attorney pleading for house arrest, the judge handed down a severe sentence of 5 years in a federal women's penitentiary. Megan collapsed into her chair, her hysterical screams echoing off the high ceiling as the marshals clamped the handcuffs tightly around her wrists. Then it was Kendrick's turn to face the judge. When the marshals escorted my son into the courtroom, I barely recognized the man standing before the bench. The slick, confident regional sales manager who had strutted through his luxury penthouse 3 months ago was completely gone. Kendrick was severely gaunt, his cheekbones protruding sharply against his pale skin. He had lost a significant amount of weight in the county jail, and his hands trembled violently as they rested on the wooden defense table. Before the judge could formally read the sentencing guidelines, Kendrick's public defender requested permission for his client to make a direct appeal to the court. The judge nodded, and Kendrick slowly turned around to face the gallery. His bloodshot eyes locked onto me sitting in the front row. "Dad." He choked out, his voice echoing weakly across the silent courtroom. "Please, I am begging you." The judge said he would consider a formal letter of leniency from the victim. "You are the only one who can save me now. If you just tell the judge to show mercy, if you just submit a statement asking for a reduced sentence, they might let me out early." Kendrick gripped the edge of the wooden barrier, openly weeping in front of the judge, the bailiffs, and the packed gallery. He brought up his childhood. He brought up Diane. He cried about how my late wife would not want to see her only son rotting away in a federal prison cell. He begged me to remember the little boy I used to take to baseball games, promising that he would spend the rest of his life making up for the terrible mistakes he had made. He laid his entire soul bare on the courtroom floor, begging his father for a single drop of salvation. The federal judge looked over his reading glasses directly at me. "Mr. Wright," the judge asked, his voice echoing through the quiet room. "As the primary victim in this extensive case of financial fraud and elder abuse, the court grants you the opportunity to make a formal victim impact statement before sentencing is finalized. Do you wish to speak on behalf of the defendant?" I stood up slowly from the wooden bench, adjusting the lapels of my dark gray suit. I walked past the low swinging gate that separated the gallery from the legal floor and approached the witness stand. I did not look at Kendrick. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the judge. "Your Honor," I began, my voice perfectly steady, carrying no trace of sorrow or hesitation. "I stand before you today not just as a victim of severe financial fraud, but as a representative of countless senior citizens who are quietly manipulated, abused, and discarded by the very people they trusted the most. The man sitting at the defense table is my biological son. I spent 40 years of my life working grueling hours on construction sites to ensure he had every possible advantage. But the crimes he committed were not born of desperation or survival. They were born of absolute, unadulterated greed and a complete lack of basic human morality." I gripped the edges of the wooden podium. "He did not just forge my signature to steal $400,000 from the home I built with my late wife. He sat in my living room and actively conspired to poison me with heavy, mind-altering sedatives. He planned to permanently destroy my cognitive function and lock me away in a decaying state-funded asylum so he could fund a luxury lifestyle with a woman who viewed him as a disposable pawn. He attempted to steal my money, my home, my sanity, and my freedom. I finally turned my head and looked directly into Kendrick's terrified, tear-filled eyes. To grant leniency today would send a dangerous message that family blood is a valid excuse for predatory abuse. I refuse to be complicit in lowering the consequences for such a monstrous betrayal. I turned back to the judge, my posture uncompromising. Your Honor, I am not writing a letter of leniency. I am formally requesting that this court impose the absolute maximum penalty allowed by federal law. I want him to face the exact measure of justice he earned. A heavy, stunned silence blanketed the courtroom. Kendrick let out a sharp, agonizing gasp, burying his face in his trembling hands as his final desperate hope was completely extinguished. The judge nodded slowly, a look of profound respect crossing his features as he absorbed the absolute finality of my statement. He looked down at his legal paperwork and folded his hands. Kendrick Wright, the judge, declared, his voice ringing with ultimate authority. Your actions demonstrate a chilling predatory calculation against a vulnerable family member. You weaponized your father's trust and attempted to orchestrate his medical and financial ruin for personal luxury. The court finds absolutely no grounds for leniency. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. For the charges of aggravated identity theft, bank fraud, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse, I sentence you to 8 years in federal prison. The gavel slammed down onto the sounding block with a violent, resounding crack that finalized the destruction of Kendrick's life. The sound echoed through the room, finalizing the sentence. 2 federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing Kendrick by the arms to pull him away from the defense table. Kendrick thrashed against their grip, twisting his head to look back at me. Dad, he screamed, his voice tearing through his throat in raw, desperate panic. Please do not leave me here. I am your son. I am your son. I stood up from the witness stand, brushing a speck of dust off my suit jacket. I did not say a word. I did not offer a final, sorrowful glance. I simply turned my back to the sound of his pathetic screaming and walked steadily down the center aisle of the courtroom. As the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind me, completely cutting off the sound of his voice, I knew the physical and emotional ties that had once bound us were permanently severed. I was no longer a father to a monster. I was just a free man walking out into the bright Atlanta sun. The fallout from the trial did not stay quietly contained within the walls of the federal courthouse. The complete collapse of Richard Kensington's real estate empire, combined with the sensational, deeply disturbing details of my son's ultimate betrayal, became a massive media spectacle. Local Atlanta news stations and national financial networks ran the story for weeks. They dedicated hours of airtime detailing how a working-class black engineer had systematically dismantled a corrupt multi-million-dollar development firm to protect his lifelong home. Reporters camped out on my street, hoping to secure an exclusive interview with the man who outsmarted a federal fraud ring. I declined every single request. I had absolutely zero interest in becoming a television celebrity or monetizing my personal tragedy for the public's entertainment. Instead, I focused entirely on the vast resources now under my control. Through Phoenix Holdings, we completely liquidated the seized Kensington assets. After recovering my original $150,000 retirement fund, I found myself holding a substantial fortune. But that money was tainted by their greed, and I refused to let it sit idly in a corporate bank account gathering dust. I sat down with Robert Pierce and drafted the framework for a new philanthropic organization. We established the Diane Wright Legal Defense Fund. It was a fully endowed nonprofit legal clinic specifically designed to provide free aggressive representation to elderly African-American homeowners in Atlanta who were being targeted by predatory developers, redlining schemes, or financially abused by their own relatives. I hired a team of ruthless, highly dedicated attorneys who specialized in property law and elder rights. We began actively auditing suspicious gentrification buyouts across the city, tearing up fraudulent contracts and locking predatory contractors out of vulnerable neighborhoods. I took the exact weapon they used to try and destroy me and turned it into an impenetrable shield for my community. With my legal and financial legacy securely established, I finally turned my attention back to the true physical center of my world. The legacy home that Kendrick had so eagerly tried to sell off to the highest bidder was officially safe, and I decided it was time to breathe new life into its foundation. I hired a crew of local contractors, men I had trained myself decades ago on various commercial sites, and we went to work. We did not tear down the history of the house. We fortified it. We reinforced the original hardwood floors with rich mahogany, upgraded the decaying plumbing, and completely modernized the kitchen where Diane used to cook Sunday dinners. I spent my mornings on the front porch drinking black coffee and listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood, knowing that no developer or greedy relative could ever take this sanctuary away from me. But my most important project was out in the backyard. For the last few years, dealing with Kendrick's constant demands and the silent creeping stress of his financial drain, I had allowed Diane's beloved rose garden to fall into severe disrepair. The soil had grown hard and the once vibrant bushes were choked with aggressive, thorny weeds. I bought new topsoil premium fertilizer and spent hours every single afternoon working the earth with my bare hands. I pruned the dead branches away carefully, nursing the roots back to optimal health. By the time the hot Georgia summer rolled around in full force, the backyard was entirely transformed. Massive, heavy blooms of crimson and pale yellow roses erupted across the property line. The sweet, familiar fragrance drifted through my open kitchen windows every evening, serving as a constant, beautiful reminder of the woman I loved and the peaceful life we had built together. At 69 years old, I finally discovered what absolute freedom truly felt like. For over 3 decades, my existence had been defined by a heavy, relentless cycle of providing and protecting. I had constantly filtered my own desires through the lens of what Kendrick needed, sacrificing my own peace of mind to fund his desperate attempts to climb a social ladder that was structurally designed to reject him. Every phone call I received used to bring a subtle spike of anxiety, an unspoken dread of what new financial emergency or emotional crisis I was expected to solve. Now, the silence in my house was not lonely. It was incredibly rich and profoundly liberating. There was absolutely no one left to drain my accounts. There was no one left to manipulate my love or weaponize my age against me. My retirement funds were generating healthy interest. My daily expenses were minimal, and my days belonged entirely to me. My physical health drastically improved. Without the crushing weight of constant stress, my blood pressure normalized and I slept a full 8 hours every single night. I woke up whenever I wanted. I took long, leisurely walks through the historic districts of Atlanta, admiring the architecture without the burden of a construction deadline. I reconnected with old friends from my engineering days, men I had lost touch with because I was too busy working overtime to buy Kendrick a new car or pay his inflated credit card bills. We met for barbecue and cold beers on the weekends, telling stories and laughing until our chests hurt. I started reading thick historical biographies, sitting in my newly renovated study, surrounded by the comforting scent of old paper and polished wood. I felt a deep, uncompromising pride settling into my bones. I had stared down this barrel of total ruin orchestrated by my own flesh and blood, and I had completely dismantled the threat without compromising a single ounce of my integrity. I had protected my wife's memory and secured our home against overwhelming odds. The intense betrayal that once threatened to shatter my heart had instead forged it into something completely unbreakable. I learned the hard way that you cannot buy loyalty, and you certainly cannot buy respect. By cutting the parasite out of my life, I had not lost a son. I had simply discarded a massive, suffocating anchor. I was living my best, most authentic life, surrounded by the fruits of my own honest labor, looking forward to the future instead of dreading the next ringing telephone. The transition into autumn brought a crisp, refreshing breeze to the city. I was standing on my front porch on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, admiring the way the changing leaves framed the street. I walked down the short concrete path to my mailbox, enjoying the simple, mundane routine of checking the daily post. I flipped the metal lid open and pulled out a small stack of envelopes. There were a few utility bills, a glossy newsletter from a local historical society I supported, and a catalog for hardware supplies. But as I shuffled through the mail, my hands suddenly stopped moving. Tucked right in the middle of the stack was a plain, cheap white envelope. The return address printed in the top left corner was not a residential home or a commercial business. It was the official, heavily stamped insignia of a United States federal correctional institution located several states away. I stared at the harsh black ink, my heart rate remaining perfectly steady despite the sudden jarring intrusion of the past into my peaceful present. I shifted my gaze to the center of the envelope, looking at the name and address written out for the recipient. The handwriting was entirely unmistakable. It was messy, slightly rushed, and aggressively slanted. It was the exact same handwriting I had seen on dozens of report cards, college applications, and forged financial documents. It was Kendrick. He had been sitting in a federal prison cell for over 6 months wearing a bright orange jumpsuit and entirely cut off from the luxury and privilege he had sacrificed his soul to obtain. And now, after hitting rock bottom in a concrete box, he was reaching out to the father he had actively tried to throw away. I stood alone in my driveway, the autumn wind rustling the dry paper in my hand, staring down at the letter that undoubtedly held the desperate, calculating words of a ruined man. I carried the cheap white envelope back inside the house, the thin paper feeling completely foreign against the thick, calloused skin of my hands. I walked into my renovated study, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across the mahogany floor. I sat down in my leather armchair and stared at the federal insignia stamped on the corner. Curiosity is a stubborn human trait, even when you already know the exact outcome. I slid my thumb under the sealed flap and tore it open. A single sheet of lined notebook paper fell out, covered entirely front to back in Kendrick's frantic, jagged handwriting. The ink was heavily smudged in several places, likely from tears of pure self-pity and sheer desperation. I did not need to read every single agonizing paragraph to understand the overall message. The words jumped off the page, practically screaming with pathetic regret. He wrote about how incredibly cold his concrete cell was, how terrible the standard prison food tasted, and how terrifying the other federal inmates were. He begged me to forgive him, swearing that he thought about my love and my sacrifices every single night in the dark. He completely blamed Megan and Richard for manipulating his fragile mind, refusing even now to take absolute accountability for his own malicious actions. And nestled right there at the bottom of the first page, hidden beneath all the manufactured apologies and fake nostalgia, was the true purpose of his correspondence. He was begging me to deposit funds into his prison commissary account so he could buy basic human comforts. He was asking me to visit him on visiting day so he could look me in the eye and prove he was a changed man. He was still trying to extract resources from the father he tried to throw away. I stared at the heavily smudged ink, searching the deepest, most foundational layers of my heart for even a microscopic fraction of sympathy. I waited for that familiar, instinctual pull of fatherly duty to rise up in my chest and demand that I rescue my helpless boy. But the emotional well was entirely dry. I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, unshakable indifference. I did not feel anger, and I certainly did not feel sorrow. I simply recognized the letter for exactly what it was. It was a poorly executed trap set by a proven predator who had temporarily run out of options. I slowly folded the lined notebook paper perfectly in half and then in half again. I stood up from my leather armchair and walked across the study toward the large brick fireplace I had meticulously restored just last month. A small, carefully constructed stack of dry cedar logs sat ready on the iron grate. I reached out and picked up a long wooden match from the mantel. I struck it firmly against the stone, the sharp scent of sulfur instantly filling the quiet room. I held the bright, flickering flame directly under the corner of Kendrick's desperate letter. The cheap prison paper caught fire immediately, the edges curling and turning black as the bright orange flames eagerly consumed his pathetic apologies. I did not read the second page. I did not need to. I held the burning letter until the intense heat licked the very tips of my fingers, and then I simply let it go. The burning paper fluttered down into the fireplace, landing softly on the cedar logs. I watched in total silence as the final remnants of his handwriting turned into glowing embers, and then finally into weightless gray ash that drifted harmlessly up the chimney and completely disappeared. I stood alone in the warm, comforting glow of the fire, finally at total peace with the legacy I had fought so ruthlessly to protect. When you reach my age, society expects you to gently fade into the background. They expect you to sit quietly in a rocking chair, blindly handing over the fruits of your lifelong labor to the next generation, regardless of whether they have actually earned it or respect it. We are conditioned from birth to believe that family is an absolute, unbreakable bond. We are taught that blood is infinitely thicker than water and that a parent's love must be completely unconditional, even in the face of sheer abuse. But I am here to tell you that unconditional love is a dangerous, highly weaponized myth. It is a lie carefully perpetuated by selfish, greedy individuals who want a permanent consequence-free pass to continuously exploit the people who genuinely care for them. My son and his fraudulent in-laws severely mistreated my kindness as a terminal weakness. They looked at my calloused hands, my quiet demeanor, and my deep dedication to my family, and they saw a foolish target. They allowed bottomless, blinding greed to completely rot their souls. They wanted the luxury of the penthouse view without ever having to pour the concrete foundation or climb the dangerous steel scaffolding. And when they realized I was not going to simply hand them my life on a silver platter, they tried to legally bury me alive. But what they fundamentally failed to understand is that true strength does not roar. It does not throw childish tantrums or demand to be noticed at a fancy country club party. True strength calculates. It waits patiently in the dark, gathering undeniable evidence, securing impenetrable assets, and striking only when the trap is flawlessly set. I did not just defeat a federal fraud ring. I defeated the toxic expectation that I owed my existence to an ungrateful child. I learned the hardest lesson a father can ever learn in this world. You can break your back providing every financial advantage in the world, but you cannot buy a person's moral compass. If the people sharing your dinner table view you as a walking bank account rather than a human being, they are not your family. They are simply well-disguised thieves waiting for you to close your eyes. Blood does not automatically grant you access to my sanctuary, and a shared last name does not give you permission to bankrupt my future. I survived their cruelty because I refused to play the victim they desperately needed me to be. For decades, I genuinely thought my greatest assets were my retirement accounts and the physical walls of this historic Atlanta home. I believed my wealth was measured by the numbers printed on my monthly bank statements and the property deeds locked securely inside my floor safe. But I was entirely wrong. Sitting here today looking out over Diane's fully restored, vibrant rose garden, I know the absolute truth. My greatest asset was never my money. My greatest asset was my own unclouded sanity, and the fierce, uncompromising clarity required to look at my own flesh and blood and see him exactly for what he was. Sometimes the most dangerous threats do not break through your front door wearing a ski mask. Sometimes they have a key to your house, sit on your sofa, and call you dad. A malignant tumor that shares your exact bloodline is still a deadly tumor, and the only way you survive its poison is to take a scalpel and ruthlessly cut it completely out of your body. I refused to let my life end in a sterile, forgotten room just so a group of arrogant predators could drink imported champagne. I fought back with the same cold, calculating precision they tried to use against me, and I walked away with every single piece of my dignity fully intact. I am Nelson Wright. I am 69 years old, and I am finally living the most vibrant, powerful, and unapologetically free chapter of my entire life. They tried to take my legacy, but they only succeeded in securing their own destruction. Let this be a warning to anyone who thinks they can prey on the elderly. We built this world, and we know exactly how to tear down the people who try to steal it from us. There is one final truth I want to share with anyone who might be walking this dark path. Society loves to convince us that aging makes us invisible, slow, and entirely oblivious to the modern world. They assume our silence is ignorance, and our patience is a terminal weakness. Let them believe it. That massive underestimation is your greatest tactical advantage. While they are busy talking loudly and making reckless moves fueled by pure entitlement, you have the quiet space to observe, to document, and to meticulously prepare. Wisdom does not shout its intentions. It watches, it learns, and it strikes only when the victory is absolute. If my journey brought you any comfort or courage today, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own stories of reclaiming your power in the comments below.